Hello, let me know where you're from in the world and what time it is after liking this video. My sister discovered a universal language, but she hasn't spoken a word since 2003. My sister is a genius. When she was about 13, she made this device that honestly still blows my mind. I've spent my entire life studying physics, and I still don't know what she did or how, which is probably for the best, considering how this all played out. I don't know how she did it. But what I do know is, in the summer of 2003, the laws governing matter and atomic mass didn't seem to affect her anymore. She was invisible to the human eye, and she was speaking a universal language we've never been able to identify or reproduce. Before I get into this, though, have you ever seen Firefly? Allow me to quote, "I am very smart. I went to the best Medicid in Osiris, top 3% of my class, finished my internship in 8 months. Gifted is the term. So when I tell you that my little sister makes me look like an idiot child, I want you to understand my full meaning. This could have been written about me and my sisters. We come from a long line of gifted people. My father is a neurologist, my mother works for SpaceX, and my eldest sister is an artist whose work has been featured in galleries since she was 12. I'm a full-time research associate of high-energy density physics at a university I can't name without risking my career. And like Simon Tam from Firefly before me, I don't tell you all of this to flaunt our intelligence or to make us look special. I tell you this so you can fully understand what I mean when I say Nirali made us all look like idiot children. In 2003, I was about to turn 17. My interests weren't like most teen girls, so I won't bore you with the details of what I found more entertaining than TV, books, or the mall. But more often than not, I was occupied with personal research projects. The first time Nirali made herself invisible, I was in the middle of a research rabbit hole. I was deep into some really heady academic articles when I heard Nirali pipe up behind me. "They're wrong, you know." I groaned inwardly. We'd had the knocking talk, but she was still so bad at respecting boundaries. "Nirali, what did we say about knocking?" "Oh," she said, and sounded genuinely surprised. "I didn't think about the door." "What?" I frowned and spun my chair around to look at her. My room was empty. Wait, empty? I looked around briefly before rubbing my eyes, wondering when I'd slept last and already writing the conversation off as an auditory hallucination. Shaking my head, I started to turn back to my computer when I heard her giggle. "All right, jerkhole, where are you?" "Right here," she giggled, her voice coming from directly in front of me. "What the? How? Did you hide the speakers again?" I stood up, taking a moment to really look around the room. She'd pulled a prank like this before, hiding a complex set of speakers she'd modified to create a confluence of sound she could manipulate. It would sound like someone was anywhere in the room she specified. She'd even made it sound like she was moving around. It was really impressive, especially since she'd only been 10 at the time. This time, though, she'd either gotten much better at hiding the speakers or something else was going on. She giggled again. "No speakers, just me." "Okay, just me. But how?" I folded my arms, looking in the direction of her disembodied voice. "That's going to be hard to explain." That was Nirali for "you won't get it." "Try me," I said, because I'm stubborn. She did, though, and I didn't. I had the beginnings of a migraine chewing on my right eye by the time she was done. Almost none of it made sense. There was something about atomic frequencies and post-dimensional drift, superliminal desynchronization, and something she dubbed the Planck supratemporal parallel. It was all way over my head. "Okay," I said, rubbing my temple as I tried to digest it all. "But how did you get here?" I walked, infuriating. "I mean, how did you get in here?" I gestured widely to the door, which was closed, and the walls around us. "Oh." I could hear the shrug in her voice. "I just walked where the walls weren't." I squinted at the spot I thought she was standing. "You... what?" She sighed. It was a special sigh. It was the kind of sigh that told you someone much smarter than you was put out at having to dumb something down enough for you to understand. An embarrassed heat flooded my cheeks. I knew she was smarter than me, smarter than all of us, but it still made me feel like I'd failed simple math in front of Neil deGrasse Tyson and a puppy, and they were both disappointed. I walked where the walls weren't. The walls aren't everywhere, Divya. In fact, in most places like realities, the walls aren't there at all. So I just walked in those places. I wanted to see the proofs of this statement, though I knew she wouldn't have bothered writing them down, except in scraps and incomplete snippets that only made sense to her. I also knew the proofs wouldn't make any more sense than her original explanation. Even so, it bothered me that I only understood what she meant in the vaguest, most conceptual way. It wasn't natural for me. That abstractness of thought warred with the linear way of my brain, making actual understanding impossible, and I hated it. Sana would have understood. Her brain worked that way, but not mine. I must have looked like I was struggling with it, and I was, because she continued on. Where I am, or technically when and how, everything is a Schrodinger's puzzle of is and isn't. All I have to do is observe the places where the state of something isn't and go there. This wasn't helping. I got the basic concept of what she was saying, but in terms of the practical application of physics, it was a mess of meaningless science-y buzzwords. Nothing she said had any foundation in known science. She could have told me I ate ice cream upside down and chanted purple backwards 30 times, and the wall turned to jello, but only as long as I looked at it from a 45-degree angle. And it would have been exactly as scientifically sound as what she'd actually said. Yet she was the one who was invisible, so the limits of my understanding and science itself had no bearing on her corporeal existence. "Do you still have a body? Can you see you?" "Oh yeah," she said, her voice pitched higher in excitement. "I look like 100 versions of me laid on top of each other. Looking at my hands and stuff is kind of trippy, but I'm here." Cool. I had no idea what to do with this information. She started giggling again. "What now? I can't believe you haven't noticed yet." Noticed what? I couldn't keep the flash of irritation out of my voice. It wasn't easy to accept the premise that she'd managed to trick physics into letting her pass through matter while being imperceptible to the human eye, but I'd had just about all the "how much dumber than Nirali are you" I could take for one day. "What language am I speaking?" I had to blink at that and think a moment. "It's English, isn't it?" She giggled again. "Say something," I ordered in my most authoritative big sister voice. "Nor again is there anyone who loves or pursues or desires to obtain pain of itself, because it is pain, but because occasionally circumstances occur in which toil and pain can procure him some great pleasure." If I concentrated, I could tell the words she was saying didn't quite match what I was apparently translating in my head, but I couldn't hear them for what they were. Except, "Wait, is that the lorem ipsum translation from definibus bonorum et malorum?" She giggled again. "Yep, want me to try something in Hindi?" "Yeah," I said, a little stunned and more than a little curious. "Go for it." "May he in whose lap shines forth the daughter of the mountain king, who carries the celestial stream on his head, on whose brow rests the crescent moon, whose throat holds poison and whose breast is support of a huge serpent, and who is adorned by the ashes on his body, may that chief of gods, the Lord of all, the destroyer of the universe, the omnipresent Shiva, the moon-like Shankara, ever protect me." I frowned, torn between focusing on the words and trying to identify what she was quoting. I started mouthing some of the words as my mind ran back over them, and gawped a little as recognition settled in. "Did you just quote the Ramcharitmanas Ayodhya Kand invocation?" Another giggle. "But how? That didn't sound like Hindi at all." "Fascinating," she said. "It didn't feel like Hindi when I said it, but I was thinking the Hindi words. What did it sound like to you?" "English, I guess. It didn't sound like anything, but I understood you in English." "That's so cool. Can you actually hear something other than English?" "Kinda. Almost. If I try, I can tell the sounds you're making don't match the meaning of the words I'm not hearing, but understanding. But the meaning overrides everything else, so I can't actually identify individual sounds or phrases." Do you think you could identify the physical linguistics if we went word by word? It may be the processing of complete phrases prevents the identification of individual phonemes. Maybe, I said, shrugging, still trapped in awe of this aspect of her discovery. We could try it. She had me run her through some general object identification to give me a chance to listen for the sounds she was making and how they differed from the words I knew, the words I was hearing, but I only ever caught the ghosts of divergent beginnings and ends. She thought this was hilarious. I thought it was magical. She started making regular trips to my room in this state, usually after lights out or when our parents were at work. I didn't blame her for sneaking. Sana wasn't into the science stuff, and if our parents knew what we'd been up to, we'd have been grounded for life, especially since Nirali had already been banned from experimental projects at home. The last one had required a lot of external help and several $1,000s to clean up. But someone had to try and catalog this universal lexicon, and this was the only way we had access to it. One night, as we lay awake on the floor naming objects, we'd tried making individual sounds before, but without the intent of meaning behind them, there was no divergence. Nirali froze. I couldn't see her, of course, but something changed. She stilled to the point I worried she'd maybe phased through the floor or something and left me alone. But somehow I still felt her presence along with something sharp and alien I couldn't identify. "Nirali?" I whispered, cold unease settling on me like snow. "Shh." It was her, but so quiet I almost missed it. I felt the urgency behind it, though, and hushed to wait in the silence with her. As the seconds ticked by, a prickling dread crawled across the room. It started at the edges where the shadows were thickest and spread outward, tainting everything it touched, including me. My pulse quickened as a primal paranoia sank in. I knew it was just Nirali and me, but it felt like a predator was stalking the shadows, searching for us, and it was only our silence that kept it from pouncing. To keep the paranoia at bay, I focused on the warm red readout of the clock above my desk. The slowly changing numbers were soothing and hypnotic. They dulled the edges of my fear until, at some point between midnight and 2 a.m., I fell asleep. I only realized this when Nirali finally whispered my name, pulling me back to reality. "Divya, wake up." I swam back to consciousness slowly, shaking off the half-formed discomfort of a dream I couldn't remember. "It's gone now." "What's gone?" I rubbed the sleep still clogging my vision and blinked at the clock above my desk. So late. Had we really been laying on the floor for 2 hours? Nirali didn't answer. Not for a long time. Long enough that I thought maybe I'd dreamed her waking me up entirely. "The shadow behind the walls," she whispered, cutting the silence away like cobwebs. There was a weight to her words I couldn't describe that tickled the primal centers of my brain again. An ancient urge calling to me, telling me to hide. "The... what?" I croaked, propping myself up on my elbows. But Nirali was gone, not just quiet. There was a difference in the room when she left, and I could always sense it, even if she didn't say she was going. A few minutes later, she was at my bedroom door, actually knocking. The sound startled me, giving my heart a sudden workout with a spike of adrenaline. I snuck over to the door to let her in. Too keenly aware of the night around me and jumping at shadows I suddenly worried couldn't be trusted. Without a word, she slipped past me and crawled into bed, hiding beneath the covers with her knees against the wall and her back to me. I took my cue as it was offered and crawled in behind her, offering myself as protection against the night. Sleep was slow in coming as my body flushed the survival instinct from its veins, but eventually it must have come as the next thing I knew the sun was peeking through the windows and Nirali was watching me sleep. "Divya?" Nirali said my name like she was testing it, as if she didn't expect to hear it again. "Yeah?" "Nothing," she said, curling back under the covers before adding, "Thanks." It was a week before she came to me through the walls again. "I think it's drawn to the language," she said, pulling me out of a dream about superfluid. "What is?" I yawned, oddly comfortable with the resumption of our nightly conversations. "The shadow behind the walls." "What is that?" "I don't know. Something big. Something old. Older than time, maybe." "What's with the sauna talk?" older than time. I don't know, Divya, that's just what it feels like. She was always like this, caught somewhere between science and emotion, like the perfect cross between me and Sana. I think it allowed her to think abstractly enough to escape the box of the known to innovate, while remaining linear enough to build a new box to house her innovations. But sometimes it meant she didn't have the math to back it up. Sometimes it was just a feeling or the hint of a notion, but even then Nurali's feelings were always spot on, even if it took science a few decades to prove it. "All right," I said, accepting that answer. It was odd, I realized then, how a few weeks of exposure to what my mind told me was factually impossible opened me to the flexibility of the possible. I was surprised, too, when I noticed my first instinct wasn't to challenge her or demand proof, just because what she said was beyond my experience or immediate comprehension. Instead, I would nod and accept that what she said, what she experienced, was simply truth, and the limitations of my understanding couldn't change that. What does it want? I don't know. I don't think it talks, but I think it listens and understands. That's unsettling, I said, shifting under the covers. The superstitious child in me made sure my feet were hidden in the center of the bed because the shadows still couldn't be trusted. She hummed her agreement. It's not the only thing here, though. A chill surged through me, prompting my heart into a panicked gallop. What do you mean? I mean there are other things, big things, old things. Most of them can't see me, I think. I'm not really where they are, same as I'm not really where you are, but they can hear me, same as you. Are you safe? Nurali was silent. My stomach churned because I knew it meant something big and old and dangerous was near enough to pose a threat. After several minutes passed, she answered, "Sometimes. Only sometimes?" I sat up, staring at the spot on the floor where she would have been seated. Only sometimes. Then why are we still doing this, Nurali? I wouldn't have agreed if I knew you were in danger. I know, she said quietly, but there's so much here. If I focus on a color, I can experience everything that color has ever been and ever will be. If I think about a time, I'm sitting in what used to be here, or sometimes what will be here, watching a blur of activity that won't happen for another 1,000 years. I've seen cities you can't even begin to imagine made of glittering bone and glass. Monolithic wonders to shame the gods. Last night I was standing in the center of a black hole. Not a hologram or a simulation, but an actual black hole. Captured, contained, reproduced, harnessed, I don't know what. But it was here, and so was I, and through the black hole I saw so many other universes, all laid out like mirrors into infinity. Nurali, I whispered, both awed and terrified. Had she been experiencing these things every night? All the hours we talked about nothing and nonsense? But there are also bigger things, she said, her voice dipping into darkness. Things that hide in the glint of starlight on glass. Things that follow me back from the future and wait for me in the past. They skip like stones on water, only touching the surface for a minute and never with their whole selves. But even that much is too much. It hurts to look at them. There are too many shapes at once, and all of them are hungry in ways I don't understand. Tears welled in my eyes as I listened to her. It hurt to accept these things as truth. I couldn't understand them, or touch them, or even experience them myself, but I had to accept they were real, because my sister was invisible. She could pass through matter at will and spoke a universal language to me every night. But accepting all that also meant accepting that my sister spent every night compelled by her own curiosity to go back to this dangerous state again and again, only to be terrified by what waited in between. I'm glad they can't see me, but I don't think that will be true much longer. What? Why? The shadow behind the walls has been in my room all week. I can feel it following me around. It's listening now, but I don't think it will come in your room again. Nene, you have to stop this. I can't, she said, her voice thick with imminent tears. Of course you can. Just come back and we'll destroy whatever you've been using to shift. We can fix this. No, she said, the word wet and bent beneath an anguish no 13-year-old should have known. You don't understand. What could possibly be worth the risk? My heart broke in the silence that stretched between us. An eternity of pain and longing swirled between us, and one final fragile breath spoke of the tears she held back when she found her voice again. I can't speak English anymore. I didn't understand. Like the first time she described the math to me, this statement defied understanding. What do you mean you can't speak English anymore? I mean I can't speak anything but this stupid between language, Divya. I tried and tried all week, but all that comes out now is this ugly mess of gurgles and scrapes and noises I don't recognize, and I'm so scared. I'm so scared because they can still hear me when I'm out there with you. And out there, I'm not invisible. And you and Sana and Mom and Dad aren't invisible. And none of us are safe when I'm out there. And the only time I can talk right is when I'm in here, she sobbed. When I'm here with you. My heart turned somersaults in my stomach. I let this happen. I should have stopped her the day she showed me her stupid science-shattering trick. Nene, I whispered. And all I wanted to do was hold her until everything was right. You have to come back. I don't know what we'll do to fix this, but you can't stay there. I know, she said through a heavy veil of tears. I just didn't want to lose you. To lose us. You still have me. But I won't out there, not like this. I didn't have a good answer for her. We'll find a way to fix it, was all I could say, and we both knew it wasn't enough. We also knew that it had to be, because we didn't have a choice. I felt her presence fade, and a few minutes later there was a quiet knock at my door. Nirali stood on the other side, shaking, as silent sobs racked her narrow frame. I gathered her up, shutting the door behind her, and together we curled around each other on the floor and cried. We cried until we passed out from exhaustion and woke up long after the sun had risen. I woke to Nirali watching me again and blinked away the haze of tear-stained sleep. Nirali? She nodded, mute, a sadness hanging over her shoulders. Can you? She shook her head. Nothing? She glanced up, looking over me and toward the hall as someone passed by. I could tell a million thoughts were flitting through her head in that moment, most of them conflicting. But after a minute or so, a stony resolution had settled in her eyes, and she scooted closer, waving for me to do the same. Her mouth was almost against my ear when something unimaginably foul rattled from her lips. A shudder of revulsion rocked through me at the sound of each mangled phoneme. I've never been so disgusted and terrified in my life. I could hear her voice, but it was dripping with caustic venom, dragging over hot coals, buried in the deepest ocean and clawing at the edges of sanity with angry talons. It was wrong, and to this day it was the most vile, viscerally upsetting experience of my life. The words, this language, was never meant to be spoken by man. Science won't support me, but I know in my bones these words have power man wasn't meant to use. And yet, despite my mind rebelling from the mere sound of her voice warped around these hideous words, I still knew what she'd meant, as if she'd said it in English. Don't tell Mom and Dad. My neighbor has been beckoning my children from his window at night. I, 33 million, live in Texas with my daughter, Alicia, 8 feet, and my son Jay, 4 feet. Their mom has been out of the picture for the past 2 years. Not dead, just a piece of shit. And I've managed pretty well as a single father. The three of us lived in a 2-bedroom in a nice neighborhood. I've got a solid job, and the kids are thankfully healthy. Everything was smooth sailing until one night 2 months ago, during which I was awoken by Jay poking me in the face. He was sobbing violently, though I recognized it as the I'm afraid kind of crying as opposed to the I'm hurt kind of crying, which made me a little less worried. Jay's always been nightmare prone, so I assumed that's what was causing him distress. When I asked him what was wrong, though, he said, "The man in the next house is making scary faces at me." I'd heard my fair share of Jay's stories about monsters terrorizing him from the dark corners of his bedroom, but this was something new. I assumed he meant our neighbor's house, and the lack of fantastical elements in his description made me uneasy. It felt too specific to be one of his usual nightmares. I got out of bed and walked with Jay in tow to my kids' room. Alicia was awake in the top bunk. From the soft glow of their nightlight, I could see her crossing her arms and scowling down at her little brother. I didn't turn on any lights to give myself a better view of the outdoors and peered out the bedroom window. Their window had curtains on it, but for once they hadn't been drawn all the way, and there was a small opening between them through which Jay must have looked out. One side of the neighbor's house, the one to our left from the street, was visible from Alicia and Jay's room. There were 2 windows on the neighbor's side of the house, but it was too dark inside to see anything. I recalled from what I'd seen in the daylight that the window on the left, the one closest to the front of the house, was the kitchen. I wasn't sure what the window on the right was, as it always had its curtains drawn. I asked Alicia if she'd seen anything, and she shook her head. "He's always having nightmares and crying. I don't want to share a room with him anymore, Dad. I never get any sleep. It's not fair." Of course, hearing that made Jay start crying again, so I let him sleep in my room for the night. He has this TMNT indoor camping tent that he prefers to his actual bed. Honestly, at that point, I half suspected his nightmare to be a ploy to get me to let him camp. Anyway, I guess I'm a total pushover because he slept in that tent in my room for the next 2 nights. On the 3rd night, I was again woken up, but this time by Alicia, who was standing over me and shaking my arm. That kid hadn't woken me up in the middle of the night for years. When I asked her what was wrong, she said, "The neighbor was making faces at me." Those words, and the fear in my daughter's voice, really put me on edge. I closed the curtains when I said goodnight. "Did you open them?" "Only a little, but it's 'cause I heard a weird noise." "What did you hear?" Alicia couldn't recall exactly. According to her, she had gotten out of bed to see what was going on, and when she lifted the curtain, she saw a light on in the neighbor's window. The curtains in the back room had been drawn back, and our neighbor was standing in his house, right up against the window frame. What was he doing? Alicia thought for a moment, and then made an expression I never want to see on my child's face, or anyone else's for that matter, ever again. I won't do it justice by describing it, but it looked something like this. First, she smiled with both sets of teeth, so that there was a little open sliver between the rows, and then she furrowed her eyebrows. She inclined her head towards me, kind of Kubrick stare-esque, and strained the muscles in her neck. The worst part, though, was what she did with her hands. She held out her left arm, forearm up. Then she clenched her right hand into a fist and moved it back and forth rapidly over her forearm. Poor thing described it as playing the violin, but it seemed pretty obvious to me that my neighbor was pantomiming cutting. Disturbed, I told Alicia to stop and to not make either the expression or the gesture again. I was angry and confused. My neighbor, a man in his 40s, was a bit of a recluse, but he had seemed normal enough in the 3 or 4 times I'd spoken to him. I couldn't fathom why he would do something like that to my kids. After asking Alicia a few more questions, I realized that my neighbor might not have done anything technically, or at least legally, wrong. It wasn't against the law to make inappropriate gestures in your own home, but it seemed like he was targeting my kids specifically. Legal or not, I planned to have a little chat with him the following morning. My last question to Alicia was if our neighbor had made any other gestures, and she nodded. Then she started making beckoning, "come here" motions with both of her hands. I had Alicia sleep in my room for the night as well. I also checked out the window in my kids' room, but like before, I saw nothing. The house was completely dark. The next morning, before work and after dropping Alicia and Jay off to school, I spent a good 5 minutes knocking on my neighbor's front door. I figured he was home since his car was in the driveway, but he never answered the door. Eventually, I had to leave for work, and as I was walking away, I turned around quickly to see if he was watching me. He was, the coward. I saw him for a split second at the front window before he ducked beneath the sill and out of view. Clearly, the guy had problems. I yelled out to him to stop fucking with us and then left. That same night, I put a plan in motion. While my kids slept in my room, I hung out in theirs. It was a Friday night, and I was ready to pull an all-nighter so that I could catch my neighbor in the act. Although I trusted my kids, I wanted to confirm that there was actually something nefarious going on before I escalated things. I made sure the house was locked up and all the curtains drawn, tucked my kids in, and sat on the floor under the window in their room. At around 9, I started marathoning midnight mass on my phone. I didn't want to wear headphones and miss any strange sounds, so I kept the volume low and mostly read subtitles. At midnight, I started to hear strange sounds. Like Alicia said, it's a bit hard to describe. Best I can do is that it was this low, repeated clicking sound. You know the chick-chick sound you make to beckon a horse? It was something like that. All I knew is that the sound was undoubtedly coming from a person. After a few minutes of this, the sound switched to what I think was supposed to be a whistle, but it came out all wrong, like someone sucking breath in through their teeth. The sound was so crisp that the neighbor's window must have been open, which was an unsettling thought given that there was only around 15 feet of space between our houses. Certain that the neighbor was at his window, and that this was my best chance to see him, I stood up and pulled the curtain back in one motion. I saw him right away. There was a dim light on in his room, allowing me to see that horrible expression Alicia had made the night prior. It was one thing to see my child's recreation, but it was far more frightening on an adult. His window was indeed open, and his arms were stuck out into the cold night, violently swiping against each other in a grotesque mimicry of self-harm. When he saw me, and realized that he was looking at another grown man and not some poor child, he stopped his erratic motions. His cartoonish grin faded, and another, more genuine emotion settled over his features: rage. The man grabbed the window and slammed it shut, then closed the curtains with the same forcefulness. I let my own curtain fall. I was a little shell-shocked, I think. Of course, I was perturbed by the sight of the man, by his face and his movement, and the fact that he'd been doing that for who knows how many nights now in an attempt to frighten my kids. However, another detail stuck out as even more concerning to me, which was the fact that I genuinely wasn't sure if the man I had just seen was my neighbor. I'd seen him so few times in the years I'd lived in that house, and I was having trouble conjuring up his face. I sat on the floor for a minute, my blood thundering in my ears. I definitely had enough evidence at that point to call the cops, right? Just as I was about to pull out my phone, I heard a tremendous smack against the glass of the bedroom window. After a brief hesitation, I pulled the curtain back again. There were no lights on in the neighbor's house, and there was also no one outside from what I could see. I pulled the curtains back a little further and saw a handprint in the top corner of the window pane. It's worth noting that our house is on a raised foundation, and that particular window is very tall, so even though the window is on the first floor, the man outside would have needed an insane vertical to get his hand up there. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As I explained the situation to them, I quickly walked around the house to see if I could catch a glimpse of the man. My last stop was my bedroom. Once inside, I locked the doors, and while still on the phone with the operator, I took my handgun out of the safe in my closet. My heart was beating out of my damn chest, but I knew I had to stay calm, even more so when I saw that Alicia was awake and looking out of the tent at me. I reassured her in as few words as I could, whispering that we were okay, but we had to stay very quiet. I sat on the edge of my bed, my firearm ready and my ears straining. My kid's tent was in the corner, and to the left of the tent, in the middle of the wall, and directly across from where I sat, was a window. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something. It was a cloudless night, and the moonlight was bright enough that I could see a silhouette through the white curtains. The dark shape was nebulous at first, but became more clear as the man outside stepped closer to the window. Somehow he knew which room we were in. The silhouette didn't move for several minutes, and I remember being thankful that from the angle at which she sat, Alicia couldn't see it. Then something happened that I couldn't entirely wrap my head around. The man stepped back from the glass and raised his arms, making a Y shape with his body and his limbs. Only his arms were far too long. They seemed to be double the length that they should have been, each arm about the same length as his entire body. I thought at first that he was holding something, maybe two pipes that just appeared to be an extension of his limbs, but I could clearly see two hands at the ends of the extremities. I could see 5 fingers on each hand, flopping around slightly as the man brought his arms closer to the window. Thud, thud, thud. I stood up and readied myself to shoot, but just then the sounds of sirens pierced the quiet night. The man outside banged his hands against the window one last time, and then it was as if someone had sliced his arms at the elbows. His forearms seemed to shear right off, and the man took off running before they so much as hit the ground. When the police officers announced themselves, I answered the door and explained the situation to them. 2 officers, a man and a woman, asked me a few questions about my neighbor, which I assume was necessary to establish probable cause for a search. Once finished, they told me to stay inside with the doors locked while they investigated the neighbor's house. I watched them through the window of Alicia and Jay's room. They knocked on the neighbor's door, and when no one answered, they tried the front door handle. I watched the unlocked door swing open. The 2 looked at one another and then entered. I'm not sure what they found inside that house. All I know is that when they emerged a few moments later, they both looked very disturbed. When I went outside to ask what they had found, the female officer told me simply, "Your neighbor's dead." The rest of the night was a blur of strangers in uniforms filing in and out of my neighbor's home. Some came to my porch afterwards to ask me questions, and none offered me any answers. They moved with tight-lipped efficiency, their faces guarded, their words clipped. At one point, I wandered to the side of the house and found several people photographing something on the ground outside my bedroom window. Before they could ask me to leave, I made out the gruesome shape of 2 human arms. The kids and I have been staying in my parents' apartment for months, and I think everyone, even Jay, is getting tired of the cramped living situation. We can't stay in the house. Alicia is way too traumatized for that, and I wouldn't be comfortable staying there while the murderer is still at large anyway. I want to sell the damn house, but our story going semi-viral is making that difficult. After all, who would want a house that, thanks to the news, has become permanently associated with phrases like dismemberment and days of torture and victim barely recognizable as human? The previous tenant left a survival guide. Some families are more dysfunctional than others. My brain hurt trying to process the things I'd learned. Derek had never mentioned his family or that he, by blood, had a claim to the building. He was always so in tune with it made sense, but it was never something I'd considered. I woke on the sofa that morning confused. I had no idea how to continue. The vine had grown almost the entire perimeter of the flat, carefully weaving between my furniture and appliances, its waxy exterior reflecting sunlight from the windows. It stopped at the bedroom door, not crossing the threshold to Jamie's prison. I bit the bullet and decided to call Terry. I hadn't spoken to her since her and the kids' visit a few days prior, and I wanted to see if she remembered Derek ever talking about his brother, or if she knew of any basement. Terry had grown up in the building. She was bound to have explored more thoroughly than Mr. Prentice. Before I could get onto any of that, I owed her an apology. My interaction with her had been rude, and I had been too distracted to check on her the past few weeks. I had been a terrible friend. I hit dial on video chat and waited for a response. When she picked up the phone, she looked even worse than she had the last time I saw her. The dark circles were beginning to look like deep, inky tattoos, permanently stained on her face. Still, she smiled, just like she always did. "Terry, are you okay? I'm so sorry about the other day. I was just..." "It's fine, Kat. I understand. Everything with Ms. Beckman must have brought back some tough feelings for you. I should have waited a day or 2. I'm sorry." My heart melted as she spoke. I'd never had such a loyal and genuine friend. "Thank you. Don't be sorry. It helped seeing you guys. How are you doing?" I asked. "I'm okay. The kids aren't behaving great at night. I'm not sure if lockdowns got to them or something else. I have to watch everything that they do. The other day I caught Eddie trying to take apart the washing machine with his claws. By the time I stopped him, Ellie had ripped up the shower curtains trying to climb them." She sounded defeated, and at best, definitely not okay. "I wish I were allowed to help. I miss you." I sighed, longing for the day I could sit and drink tea with her. "Are you okay, Kat?" "You haven't been yourself," she asked. We may not have known each other that long, but she could sense when things weren't right. Terry was the epitome of an empath, This, I'd come to realize over the months, had been the only reason she kept in touch with Prudence. She's just so damn nice. I'm not. I don't know if you know about Essie's predictions, but she made one for me, and it sent me to some strange places. I'll tell you more when I figure it out, but for now, I need your help. I still chose to omit Jamie from my confessions, but I was ready to be a bit more open. I wasn't too ashamed to admit I needed help. Terry clearly knew about Essie's gift. She didn't bat an eyelid. Anything. Do you remember Derek ever mentioning a brother, even when you were growing up? I asked. Not at all. Derek was always on his own, just appearing when we needed him. I was really young when he first disappeared, though, so I don't remember him well and might not be the one to ask. Terry's face scrunched up in thought as she racked her brain. I'm going to send you something. I minimized the video chat and copied the photo from the email onto my phone and sent it to her by text. Her video paused for a moment as she did the same to check the attachment. He was the first to live here, Terry. His dad built the place. Terry's video clicked back on. Where did you find this? She asked. I explained the blog and why I had been looking. It wasn't a short explanation, so I'll spare you that. We even broke from the seriousness briefly for the kids to come and fawn over the kittens. Eddie loved Mr. Meow, whilst Ellie wanted to kidnap Tetley. Wrinkles just curled up with me. He was my secret favorite anyway. Terry was fascinated by the vine. She wondered if it had a connection to Derek, especially given the photo I'd found on my search. I can't say the thought hadn't crossed my mind either. I learned more about him every day, but he would always first and foremost be the gardener. The vine made sense, but the basement didn't. I was struggling to connect it to the brothers. I don't know about a basement, Cat, but if this place is as old as you say, then who knows? I know I may look haggard. She pulled on her cheeks and giggled. But I'm really not that old. I laughed. I was sad that she didn't have any more information, but it was nice to just talk to a friend. For 5 minutes, life felt normal. I'd kept my secret, and talking to Terry, I'd almost managed to forget about Jamie myself. If it hadn't been for the deep bite wound on my finger from the feeding the day before, and the open cuts on my chest from his attack, I might have been successful. I still had no idea what the riddle Essie had given to me meant. I was looking as hard as I could, and it had led me down a rabbit hole that just kept spewing more questions. What I did know was that with Jamie's seemingly permanent change in demeanor, I was running out of time. The growling hadn't stopped. The look of pure hatred as I dropped in food didn't end, and I was getting frightened. Something had to give. Either Jamie was going to die, or I would. There wasn't another option I could see, and the former may have been entirely unachievable. Derek destroyed Lila, but he never returned after. Prudence claimed she killed the original wave of creatures by setting light to them all on the already burnt-out 9th floor. Again, something entirely unachievable without Derek's presence. I had to find him. I said my goodbyes to Terry, promised that I would update her when and if I could, and left to do my daily errands for Mr. Prentice and the couple next door. As I left for the exit, I spotted a man going into Ms. Beckman's flat. I recognized him as the son that I'd always seen visiting, eyes glazed with tears. Terry had said that she would get Molly to inform Essie's family, but I couldn't imagine what Molly might have said happened. I should have gone to him, just as a human being tried to comfort him, but I couldn't bring myself to do it without an explanation to offer. I promised myself that I would visit him when lockdown was over, and I knew why his mother was gone. I rushed out and completed my errands as quickly as possible, eager to get home. Even having the name Albert Miles might have been helpful if I just kept digging on the internet. After I dropped the bags off at Percy and Sylvia's door, I turned the key in my own, entered and shut it behind me like I always would. That was where the normality ended, and my life was disrupted by an uninvited guest. When I turned to face the flat and caught a glimpse of my fold-out table, there was a tall figure stood right next to it. Albert, like Derek, was a little older than he had been in the photo. There was a family resemblance, but the eyes weren't the same. Albert's weren't warm and kind. They were cold and filled with malice. He wore a suit, similar to the one in the picture, but it wasn't as sharp. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and tattered, with loose threads hanging everywhere. like clothes that had been dug out of a box in the attic. He grinned at me. It was smug, like something you might expect from a slimy car salesman. It's been a long time since I had to visit any of the residents up here. I like what you've done with the place. Much more modern than when that old bent before you lived here. I was frozen to the spot. I hadn't been alarmed when his brother had appeared inches from me on a bench, but something about Albert was much more sinister. The thought of his son, dead on the balcony, played on repeat in my mind. "Why are you here?" I asked. He laughed. The smug grin extended across his cheeks. "I like you. You didn't even pretend not to know who I am. You know, Kat, I've always appreciated a person who cuts the small talk. It's better in business and in life. That trait will hold you in good stead." He was animated as he spoke, gesticulating wildly. "You didn't answer my question. Don't you find that ironic considering your sentiment?" I answered back, still terrified, but figuring that keeping him talking might somehow help the situation. "I don't need to answer your question. You know why I'm here." He continued to grin, raising an eyebrow and adjusting the torn sleeves of his suit. "It's not often that I've come across a tenant that causes as much chaos as you do. It's usually issues with the rent, and even something like that hasn't happened for quite some time. But you are something special." He stamped on part of the vine that was growing near his feet, and I watched as the enormous structure withered and shrunk in size, as if it were in notable pain. The beginning of my entire ordeal flooded back to me. I was back in my kitchen, discovering Prudence's note for the first time, reading the one rule that I'd never learned anything more about. 1. The landlord will never bother you. He doesn't visit, call, or communicate in any way, but make sure to pay your rent in a timely fashion always. I have only dealt with him once in 35 years, and let's just say I never missed another rent day. Any repairs required, you speak to the agent you rented the place with. Rule number 1. So much happened that I hadn't thought much about that rule, but there must have been a reason she put it first, before even mentioning the creatures. Suddenly, the literal monster in my closet seemed soft and fluffy in comparison to the ageless man stood in front of me. "I've paid my rent. Why are you here?" I stood firmly, curling my shaking hands into fists. It was more for comfort than aggression. On the surface, I was hoping it would appear I was standing my ground. The rent part was true. It was hard, but I always found a way. I was still training to teach and pulled in extra cash running after school clubs as I trained. Even during lockdown, I was creating digital learning tools. This place was my home, and I'd followed the first rule to the letter to keep it. "Maybe you aren't as bright as I thought." He rolled his eyes. "Let's list reasons a landlord might want to visit, shall we? Damage to property, unauthorized modification of communal spaces, digging around where it's not wanted or needed, nurturing my brother's unnatural experiments." He went to continue, but I stopped him. "What do you mean, unnatural experiments?" Albert laughed even harder than before. I could see in his eyes that he considered me entirely dense by this stage. "You think those 3 little abominations you took in came out of nowhere? They were a cry for help, you stupid girl, like a flare, and all you could do was pick it up and let it burn your fingers." He scoffed, laughing at his own bad joke. My heart sunk, wondering where the kittens were and if he'd hurt them. "After all the trouble you caused when he helped you last time, I wasn't going to let my idiot brother continue to roam my halls, especially not after what you did once he was gone." I gulped. I knew exactly what he was talking about. He knew that I knew as well. Albert was more than a few steps ahead of me. I realized that Prudence destroying his garden had probably never banished Derek at all. He had been kept prisoner by the man in front of me. If Albert could keep someone with Derek's knowledge and abilities trapped, then I didn't stand a chance. "Shall we talk about that thing you keep in your bedroom, Kat?" "I didn't mean to. I'm so sorry. I've regretted it since." I stuttered. I felt a tear run down my cheek as I anticipated imminent death. "I know that. You wouldn't have even known how if my brother had never told the last woman. And he pretends to be so pious." The smile on his face had disappeared. Even the thought of Derek left him with a scowl. He just tried to help the residents here. Please, I made a mistake. I protested, anticipating that I was about to die, or even worse. Albert didn't speak. He just huffed in frustration and turned to walk towards the bedroom. I followed him, trying not to stay too close. The floor was trailed with blood, and as he entered the room, I noticed the wardrobe door was practically shattered. You couldn't even contain your mistake properly. He gestured to Jamie, who was in the corner, hunched over the blood-smothered body of a kitten that he was crunching on the bones of. Tiny bits of muscle and skin in pools of blood littered the floor. His eyes were beady and black. Any semblance of Jamie I'd once seen in them was gone. I noticed Tetley and Wrinkles shivering together in the opposite corner, trying to hide from the monster. The brief relief I felt that they hadn't all met the same fate was interrupted when Jamie started to growl at Albert, baring his crimson-splashed teeth as menacingly as he could. I watched in horror as Albert just stood there, staring at the increasingly angry beast. The creature I had been hiding for all these months lunged at him aggressively, claws outstretched. Albert wasn't fazed. He barely even moved a muscle, just reached out a tattered sleeve and waited for Jamie to make contact with his hand. The second Jamie touched Albert, he let out the most almighty, inhuman scream you could imagine. It felt like my eardrums were about to burst, and I instinctively put my hands over them. Albert put his hand back down by his side as Jamie fell in a heap to the floor. He wasn't moving. Not like when I'd stabbed him with the poker. He wasn't just still, he was dead still. The heap of fur he had become started to morph on the floor. His jaw pulled inwards as if it were dislocating, and his limbs began to stretch and shed their fur. After a while, Jamie was laid there on the floor. Not the rat Jamie, the real one. The one I'd spent years with and searched for a home with. The one who knew me before all this shit ever happened. And he was dead too. For real this time. It took everything I had not to throw myself on the floor with him. I stopped myself multiple times, but Albert's eyes bore into my soul and rendered me unable to move a muscle. I tried to fight back tears, but I couldn't. Don't bother to cry. He died a long time ago. Albert kicked Jamie's corpse and bent down into a squat to get closer to him, not taking his eyes off me. I didn't let him out, if that's what you were thinking. No, Cat. You did when you locked an angry animal in a cage. Eventually they all get free. I whimpered a little as he inspected the remains of my boyfriend, intensely taking in his hair and eyes. My brother had this preconceived notion that humans can live in harmony with the evil that inhabits this building. He's wrong, Cat. We can't. Eventually it drives us all mad. Your mistake made such an unusual racket, I had to come and see what was going on. Did you ever imagine keeping him like that before you lived here? Of course not. I tried to interject, but he wouldn't let me. He was in full-blown monologue. This place fucks us up, Cat. You can't make it any better, regardless of how many shrubs you plant outside. He stroked Jamie's cold, dead face gently, barely touching it with his fingertips. The body evaporated beneath them, becoming nothing more than a pile of dust on my carpet. I hadn't even got to touch him, one last time. Albert stood back up, salesman grin plastered back on his face, and brushed his sleeves. I've cleaned up your mistake. Aren't you going to say thank you? I held back the bile that was forming in my throat, took a deep breath, and summoned every ounce of strength that I could just to speak. He was right, this place had fucked me up. But losing your partner like that would do the same to anyone. I thought of the little boy in the mirror, Mr. Prentice, even Ellie and Eddie. This wasn't for me. You're wrong about this place. Not everything here is evil. I made a mistake, but it's you that's evil. You killed your own son. What I did came from love. I blurted, trying to organize my thoughts. You don't know a damn thing about my son, and you won't. This is your only warning, Cat. Stop digging into my family. Consider my brother dead and keep quiet. He spoke sternly. I didn't dare try to talk back again. Despite knowing I'd hit a nerve, everything about him set me on edge. He took another vicious stamp on part of the vine as he exited the bedroom. It shriveled entirely underneath his dusty dress shoes, back to the size that it had been when I pulled my foot free, except it wasn't green anymore. It was brown and rotten. He turned to me once more before he reached the front door of the flat to leave and spoke. "If you dare continue your pointless little mission to try and find Derek, you will meet the same fate as that blind old bat from down the hall. People here will always do as I tell them. Let her be an example of why not to meddle in my family business. Feel lucky that I didn't eviscerate you on the spot, or worse." He winked at me, knowing that he had complete control of the situation, and left with a simple, "Bye for now, cat." As the door slammed, the two remaining kittens bounded to my feet, shaking with fear. I scooped them up despite the burning and held them close. I wasn't going to let anything happen to them. The flat had an emptiness I wasn't used to, even when it had been just me with no kittens. Before I repeated the ritual to bring Jamie back as a creature, there was the comforting knowledge that he existed somewhere. There was hope. The pile of dust on my bedroom floor and the shattered remains of my wardrobe were all I had left of him now. Then there were Mr. Meow's remains, a glaring reminder of my failure to keep anything alive or safe. I cried for him as I scooped his parts into a shoebox ready to bury in the garden the next day. It was all my fault. Jamie, Mr. Meow, Esther, they were all dead because of me. I considered calling Terry back, telling her what happened, but I decided to keep my mouth shut. My stupidity had already cost lives, and I wasn't prepared to risk her or the kids. They really were family to me. I wasn't about to give up, though. All the heartache I'd caused, the tears of Essie's son, and the months my boyfriend spent trapped in the body of a vile beast, maybe they wouldn't be in vain if I was able to save Derek from his brother. The empty, gaping grief that I felt left me perfectly accepting of the prospect of a suicide mission. I cuddled the kittens and felt the skin of my arms start to melt and sizzle. If they really were a cry for help, I had to listen. I just couldn't let it go. The previous tenant left a survival guide. There isn't a guide for these floors. Looking at that button panel in the lift that didn't lead home, I felt a knot form in my stomach. Why hadn't Albert appeared, and which button was I supposed to press? "Where are we going, Kat?" Ellie asked. She had stopped crying, but every word was heavy with fear. In truth, I didn't really know the answer to her question. I stared at the panel, taking in every number and noting its inclusion of a -9. "We're going to see if there's anyone else around," I answered. I didn't like my chances with whatever might inhabit that floor. If wherever we were was a reverse of the building, then number 9 could be nasty, so I started cautiously, pressing the -2 button. Mechanics whirred, and the large metal doors clapped shut. I wished that I had been behind the real lift's doors before it disappeared from sight. The lift that we stood in was as identical to the original as possible. Even the shiver it sent up my spine just being inside it felt the same. I was grateful when it stopped, and the doors opened to reveal a relatively normal-looking corridor, reminiscent of the ones above in the upper building. I would have believed that I'd imagined the lift falling and was arriving home if it weren't for the large black -2 painted next to the metal doors, the lack of any windows, and an obnoxious artificial light that I was sure would give me a migraine if I stood there for too long. I don't know what I hoped would be behind the red wooden door that led to a vast stretch of flats. I didn't suppose that finding Derek in something that the fake lift had indicated was as large as the building would be that simple, but perhaps it would provide some answers. Albert himself was a possibility. I couldn't predict his moves, but I had a strong feeling he wouldn't be able to contain his intellectual gloating at the failure of my plan for long. "I don't like it here." The small voice broke my stream of thoughts. "Me neither, Ellie. Hopefully someone will be home and know how we can get back upstairs." I feebly attempted to smile at my tiny companion, but she was a child, not an idiot. She saw straight through me. "I don't think we should go through that door." Ellie gestured to the red wooden door, separating us from the windowless flats. She planted her feet firmly to the spot and refused to move any further. "Do you have any better ideas?" I asked, genuinely hopeful. "I just have a really bad feeling." Her words didn't fill me with a sense of comfort or optimism, but I saw little choice. I reached for the handle and pulled at the door. It creaked loudly as it opened, releasing a strong, musky smell, like something that had been shut away for a long time. I took a tentative step inside alone, leaving Ellie just behind in the corridor, and shouted hello, hoping that if anyone was in there that visitors were usually scarce and they may come out. Unlike my previous plans, this worked flawlessly, and within minutes each of the doors were slowly opening. I counted around 10 doors in total as human arms and fingers started to emerge from behind them. The flats were filled with, and I use this term loosely, people. They weren't typical. None of them were dressed, and they had fleshy limbs and appendages sticking out of all the wrong places. There were elongated necks, multiple arms and spines bent completely backwards. It shocked me that any of them could walk at all. Each one of them looked like a unique result of intense torture. Torture that should have killed them long before they reached the stage they were at. Remembering where I was, I realized that they probably were killed long ago, or they never lived to begin with. One in particular caught my eye. It had a neck at least 3 feet long, and I couldn't distinguish its gender at all. Its back was bent in a way that a child might to do the crab, and it was balanced on all fours. Instead of 2 arms and 2 legs, all 4 limbs were left arms, all facing the same direction. Its neck lolled backwards, swinging from side to side a little and struggling to support itself. I inhaled sharply as its head lifted slightly into a steadier position, and it locked eyes with me. It screamed. The scream that came from that thing was the single most distressing sound I've ever had to listen to. It penetrated my soul, and I felt every inch of pain and suffering that laced it. My stomach churned and the shrill pitch burrowed into my brain. It left me completely immobile as every other person-like creature in the room lifted its head, wherever it balanced, and screamed in unison with the first. Holding my hands to my ears, I started to feel a warm liquid trickling from them, but I couldn't take my only protection away to see what it was. I can't even begin to describe the pain that I felt. There are no words for a misery that deep. I don't know how, but I could feel years upon years of torment and unimaginable pain that they'd gone through. The screaming became so overwhelming and all-consuming that I started to feel myself getting dizzy. There was a violent tug at my shirt, forcing me backwards before an almighty hiss, vicious enough to cut through the screams and silence them, echoing through the corridor. It took seconds for each and every one of the mangled people to shrivel back into their flats, winding limbs clambering in all directions. Leaving Ellie stood there, horn tips gleaming in the artificial light. What were they, Cat? I barely heard the muffled sound she was making that had replaced the heart-wrenching screams. I finally pulled my hands away from my ears to see them covered in blood. Ellie noticed and wrapped her arms around me, nicking me accidentally in the side with a claw. It hurt, but I didn't want to make a fuss. In that moment, I knew no pain could measure up to what I'd felt during my short time amongst the mangled people. I don't know. How did you do that? I could still barely hear the sounds of my own voice. It was like I was wearing a hat pulled over my ears, despite nothing of the sort, and my hair being shoved into a bun on top of my head. I didn't do anything. I thought they were going to eat us both, she replied, hyped on the adrenaline. But they all ran away. I guess I'm just extra scary, she answered, a pride in her voice that only a child could produce. I just looked down at her and ruffled the blonde hair between her horns. She was frightening looking, sure, but she had nothing on those things, or even the creatures in the lift. I couldn't understand why such ferocious monsters were so scared of a little girl. Why would they run instantly? It made me uneasy, but I loved the twins, no matter how unusual they were. I just wished that I could be more of a protector for her than it being the other way round. We stumbled into the corridor, and I was again confronted by the metal doors of the fake lift. To the other side of them there was an entrance, presumably to a stairwell if the under-tower we were trapped in continued to be a mirror of home. After spending what felt like hours in a lift, the idea of stairs comforted me, and I ushered Ellie towards the entrance. There were no stairs going upwards back to floor -1. They only went downwards, the odd artificial light not quite covering the bottom of the set we were at the top of. My ears rung with the sound of the mangled people's screams. Do you think they skipped too? Ellie asked me, looking into the abyss with her own impossibly deep black voids. Let's find out, I answered, gripping her hand again as we started to walk towards the darkness. We reached floor -3 quickly, in one average flight. I considered exploring the corridor of flats that existed on that floor too, but Ellie planted herself firmly to the ground again and insisted we didn't. I wasn't about to argue with her. Sound still hadn't returned to normal, and I'd learned from my mistake. I couldn't bear to face anything like the previous floor again. We climbed down another flight of stairs. The ones we had just descended were still there, leading back up, when we reached the bottom, giving me some comfort that as long as we could reach the lift on floor -2, we should at least be able to get back to the cold, dim but empty basement. This time the stairs did skip, giving some sort of semblance of home. The big black -5 sign was jarring, but missing a floor had allowed me to tell myself that these stairs were just an extension of the proper ones. More jarring was the woman. She looked right at us, at my demon sidekick, then it terrified everything else. And she didn't run. In fact, she didn't move at all. It's as if she were looking straight through us. Ellie didn't panic either. She didn't tell me to get away or hiss at the woman. She just stared back. Her hair was a mousy brown, and her features beautiful, yet average. There was nothing particularly distinct about her, except for how much she reminded me of someone else. She was a perfect mirror of her counterpart. She had the same vacant yet sad expression that the man on floor 5 always had. I wondered for a moment what her name might be. "She misses him," Ellie said. I looked down at her in confusion. "How do you know that?" I asked, not bothering to question who she meant. "I don't know, I just do." She shrugged nonchalantly. I sat on the step next to the standing woman and despaired. This whole place was like a sick joke. There was no sign of Albert, Derek, or any way out of the labyrinth we trapped in so far, and I couldn't comprehend just how much of an imbecile I'd been. Between the thoughts of never getting out, how I'd endangered the entire block, how hungry the kittens would get, Jamie and those awful screams, my head felt ready to explode. The incessant ringing was only getting worse. The woman next to me didn't move a muscle, just stood staring into the open space in front of her. I looked at Ellie, knowing that she was special, and didn't doubt what she had told me. I could feel for myself that the woman missed the man. I understood how she felt, to lose her love to the building. My heart truly bled for her. "We need to keep going. There has to be someone here that can talk to us. We need to get you back home to your mom and brother." I spoke, attempting to stay focused. I smiled another forced, optimistic smile at Ellie and gestured for her to follow me further down the spiraling, artificially lit stairs. I wasn't sure what I hoped to find, or even where I was aiming. Perhaps floor -9 was my best bet at any sort of answers. I didn't get a chance to test that theory. Once we reached the bottom of the flight, we were once again faced with the big black -5. The woman was stood in the same position, facing forwards. "Come on." I grabbed Ellie and tried to repeat the action. The stairs had always skipped. It wasn't anything unusual. It wasn't until it was. By the 6th time we had attempted the stairs, Ellie was looking tired and scared. Despite her voids for eyes, the rest of her face displayed fear like any normal child. "Kat, it's okay. We just need to keep trying." I tried to convince myself as much as her. "No. She doesn't want to be alone. That's why we can't leave." She let go of my hand and extended a long clawed finger in the direction of the woman. She hadn't moved from her spot, and there wasn't a noticeable change in facial expression or demeanor, however. Something about her felt entirely off, hostile even. I understood grief and doing everything possible to keep people close that you should let go. I wish that were what I thought the woman's intentions were, I really do. Instead, it felt more literal than that, more like she just really couldn't bear to be alone again, at any cost. "Just keep going." We ran down the stairs again, then up them and down again. 3 more times and the terror started to build. Each time we arrived in front of the -5, the woman seemed more sinister, more malignant. She wasn't looking through us anymore. She was looking straight at us. "My legs hurt, Kat," Ellie whined. "Mine did too. Do you think you could scare her?" I felt sick even suggesting it. but Ellie had the best chances of getting us away from the stairwell. Ellie shook on the spot but nodded and took a few steps towards her. She got close to the woman's face and hissed, claws out. The woman didn't move. She didn't blink or flinch at all. She just stayed in her spot. Nothing at first until she started to move. All that changed was her face, as the corners of her lips curled into a hollow smile. The comfort I had felt from the familiarity of the woman and the floor number was dead in the water the moment she smiled. Ellie had retreated in an instant, tugging at my shirt again and shuffling closer. I think the fact that she did nothing else at all made it even more disconcerting. The woman had the upper hand, and she wasn't going to let us go. "Please," I begged. "If there's anything we can do to help you, please tell us." I fought my fear, doing everything I could to be kind. If she had ever been a person, she might somehow pity our plight. "I say hello to your man. I don't know his name, and he's quiet like you. I think he misses you too. I know he does. I lost someone I loved just like you did. I know how you feel." A singular tear rolled down her cheek, but the smile stayed in place. My chest thumped as my heart pounded against my rib cage. Maybe I was getting through to her. Her eyes were haunting and hypnotic as they made contact with mine. It was like her brain was scrambled and she couldn't put the pieces back together. Her eyes were more expressive than I had ever seen before on any person, filled with confusion and sadness. After a few moments of intimate communication with our eyes, the woman moved more than I had ever seen her or the man move. She cocked her neck to the side and tilted her head in Ellie's direction. A few seconds after her neck had turned, her eyes followed, and she looked intensely at the child, smile plastered on her face, and the evaporating trail of the tear still visible in the gleaming light. Ellie started to cry, terrified. She tried to take a step behind me to use me as some sort of shield. No matter how many monsters she fought, she was still a scared kid. The woman took a labored step towards her. It took her a long time to put one foot in front of the other. Standing in one position for so long must do a real number on the muscles, even for those of a supernatural persuasion. Nonetheless, her step was an immediate threat. I could feel that her intentions were malevolent. The sadness in her eyes had developed into a disdain, and that single step was a declaration of war. Me and Ellie started to back away slowly, readying ourselves to break into a sprint down the stairs. I was prepared to run them in an endless loop forever, if it meant keeping that little girl away from the woman. Before we could even reach the first step, there was a voice. A male voice. "That's enough now, Angela. I didn't think you were one to make children cry." I turned to the man now standing next to the woman, who had returned to her spot by the stairs, visibly calmed. He had one hand on her upper arm, but he didn't need it there. She wouldn't dare disobey him. His kindly eyes and smile that held real warmth were arranged beneath a familiar flat cap. "I wish I could say it were nice to see you, Kat, but given the circumstances, I better not," he continued, speaking directly to me this time. "Who's he?" Ellie interrupted, tugging the same spot on my shirt where the material had begun to stretch. I smiled at her for real for the first time since our nightmare began. "Ellie, this is Derek. The previous tenant left a survival guide. This building will never be short of surprises." Home didn't feel as empty as it once had. Even without Jamie or Mr. Meow, I felt more hope than I had in months. I greeted Wrinkles and Tetley, fed them, and sat down to smoke at my fold-out table. Natural sun poured in through the windows, but my home would never look quite the same after my time in the Undertower. I turned on the shower and must have stood underneath the water, watching Albert's blood run down the sink for at least half an hour. Overwhelmed doesn't cover it. Shut down would be more accurate. I dithered while getting ready, exhausted and starting to feel the lack of sleep once again. My eyes were heavy. Sitting down on the bed was fatal. I woke up a few hours later, worried that I'd left Derek waiting. I rushed out of the flat and down the stairs to the garden. They were extra kind and only made me take one flight going straight from my floor to the main entrance. I couldn't have been more grateful. I was so exhausted. Outside on the bench, there he was. I don't know how or where he got clean, but the flat cap was as fresh as ever. I suppose after all the unbelievable things I'd learned, I shouldn't have even spared it a thought, but it was magic nonetheless. "I'm sorry, I fell asleep," I shouted before he had a chance to turn his head and notice me. "It's fine, Kat. I had a few things to do anyway." He spoke with a smile, the kind that you can hear just in a person's tone, and as I approached him in the garden, I realized why. I felt a lump form in my throat and tears well in my eyes as I noticed the tiny bundle in his lap. It was bald, wrinkly, and had exactly 3 legs. Mr. Meow. There was nothing I could do about his foot. I think the others ate that. But I thought this little guy deserved another shot at life. Derek grinned from ear to ear as I stared in disbelief at the tiny cat in front of me. Disregarding their burning properties entirely, I scooped him up and held him close, only putting him down as he singed my face a little. Thoughts started to whir in my mind, but before they could ever fully develop, Derek turned to me gravely and squashed them. "I know what you're thinking, but there was nothing I could do for Jamie. After what Albert did." "Don't apologize." I cut him off. "What I did was selfish. Albert was right. Jamie died a long time ago. Sometimes I wonder if, even if I could have him back, maybe I'm a different person now to the one he knew." Derek didn't respond. He just watched while I played with Mr. Meow, tickling his belly as he rolled around purring on my lap. "I know you must still have a lot of questions, and if I'm honest, I'm not sure any of them have answers that will satisfy. I'm no oracle. I still have questions myself, but I want to tell you what I know." I looked at him in confusion. Almost all loose ends had already been tied, and anything else seemed almost arbitrary. But Derek did everything with purpose, so I stayed quiet and I listened. "Albert and I were never close. I told you downstairs that not trying harder was my biggest regret. I've come to realize that was a lie, and it's time I faced the true regret that haunts me." I tried to imagine what he could be talking about, but I couldn't. I nodded and listened instead. "When we moved in, after our father died, we continued to lead very separate lives. I worked on the garden, and I embraced the strange things that happened around me. I don't know why I found it so easy to accept. I've seen hundreds come through this block, and almost all of them have been horrified at first, but I wasn't. When we first got here, there were only a handful of occurrences that showed themselves. The boy that lives in the mirror and the postman, along with others, came with the building. The longer we stayed, the more we discovered. I saw it as magic, a whole new world that most people never get to see. Albert didn't see it that way. He became paranoid, always looking over his shoulder, thinking that things were out to get him. Derek took a moment to look at the grass, a sadness on his face, and I grabbed his fingerless hand to comfort him. "What happened to him?" I asked. "He wasn't always the man you met. He was always a cold, ruthless bastard, but I would have never considered him evil. This place, the place that you and I call home, it started to drive him into darker and darker places. He didn't move his family in with him. He wanted to keep them separate from his business, and although I was intent on staying here, Albert never expected to be here longer than a few months. They would come and visit, and his wife Darla started to express concerns to me. She would come by my flat after visiting him, leaving their son with him to spend some time together while she claimed she was shopping in the city. She said he seemed frightened and angry. She was worried that he was losing his mind. Tears started to roll from his kindly eyes. Derek had always seemed so wholly good, such a wonderful person that it was hard to consider him mourning someone like Albert. But no one chooses the family they're born into, and I don't believe that anyone is entirely good or bad. Having feelings for an awful person couldn't take away from his spirit." "What did you do?" "This is exactly it, Kat. I didn't do anything. I dismissed Darla entirely, and I was wrapped up in my own world of discovery. I wrote him off under the assumption he wouldn't have listened to me anyway. Albert got worse, Darla got more worried, and eventually he stopped answering the door. Mental health services were terrible in those days. There wasn't a great deal we could do. Albert controlled his money, and Darla couldn't get her hands on it to pay for care. If I hadn't ignored it, then maybe his son would be alive, I interrupted. I wish it were that simple. He answered and paused for a moment. We sat in silence, just holding hands for a few minutes until he spoke again. I need to show you. It's the only way you'll understand. He gestured to Mr. Meow. Let's take him home. We took the stairs, skipping a few floors as we went, before reaching the door to my flat. The real one, without the minus symbol in front. It was the first time that Derek had been inside since I had moved in, and it felt good to be in a room with him while not in a state of imminent crisis. The kittens were pleased to be reunited and were quickly cuddled in a heap on the sofa. Mr. Meow's return brought me more joy than I thought possible. I retrieved the chair that I'd used to prop up Jamie's prison and made tea before we sat together at the fold-out table. "What do you need to show me?" I asked. He didn't answer me directly and instead continued to talk about his family. His name was Jonathan, my nephew. I may not have been best of friends with my brother, but I loved that boy more than life itself. He enjoyed the garden and getting dirty. He wasn't like Albert or our father, he was a worker like me. I smiled. It was nice to imagine someone taking after Derek. He sounds wonderful. He was. He was only 19 years old when he died. No life at all, especially when you consider how many years me and his father have lived for. He had just started his own business, had a fiancée, and even in the worst of times, he didn't give up on his dad. It broke his heart when my brother stopped answering the door, so he got creative and resorted to desperate measures to try and reach Albert. I started to piece things together in my head, a pit forming in my stomach as I stopped him to ask the one question that was on my mind. What was his business? Derek looked at me, shame in his eyes. He knew that he would have to say it out loud and confirm what I already knew. He was a window cleaner. I didn't say a word. I wasn't sure how to respond. I racked my brain trying to comprehend what I was hearing. The knocking on the balcony doors from behind the curtain started. The familiar groaning and whining sound soon followed. Derek could sense my discomfort and broke the silence. When Jonathan climbed the tower to try and see his dad, he scared him. Albert wasn't in a good way. He was edgy and defensive. I don't know what happened for sure, but that knock from the outside must have really triggered something. He went outside and he stabbed him, multiple times with a kitchen knife, but you know that bit. It's what happened next that wasn't reported. My mouth hung open. Albert came to me. He told me exactly what he'd done. We fought. I could have killed him myself, but when I looked at him, I could see that he wasn't right. It was in his eyes, Kat. He wasn't my brother anymore. I tried to reason with him and get him to hand himself in, but he refused and got aggressive with me, saying that I just wanted to get my hands on the block. I left him in my flat to calm down so I could go to Jonathan. The window cleaner continued to scratch on the balcony door, his whines accompanying Derek's tale. He was out there on the balcony. He was dead. One look at him and I knew no ambulance could help him anymore. I sat with him for an eternity, trying to work out what to do. I should have called the police, but I couldn't bring myself to shop my own brother. There was no hope for Jonathan, but I thought I could help Albert. I was wrong. When I returned to my flat, he was gone. I begged the building to help me. I would have done anything to bring Jonathan back. But wishes work in mysterious ways here, and once the body was found, Albert was already missing, and my nephew had become the monster that lives on the balconies to this day. I stopped him. I tried to process what he was telling me. But he wasn't found for days. Why didn't you call the police? Why did you tell the residents not to let him in? I asked, confused. Love works in mysterious ways, Kat. I hope that you of all people can understand that. I was never fond of my brother, but I did love him, and without any way of saving his son, I wanted to give him a head start. And the residents? I asked again, remembering the strict rule that Prudence had left, stating I shouldn't let him in under any circumstances. That's where things get complicated. I didn't realize at the time, but what he became was the building's way of giving him back to me. He is what he is because of me. When you see, you'll understand. He grabbed my hand and walked me to the balcony doors. letting go and pulling back the curtain to reveal the friendly-looking man I'd always seen outside my window, collapsed against it, scratching on the glass. Upon second inspection, I could see the family resemblance, but it wasn't one that I'd ever considered possible before. Prudence had told me about her experience with him, with Derek showing her what he truly looked like. I still hadn't expected quite what I saw when Derek rested his hand on my shoulder and told me to look. The window cleaner was gaunt, with bones protruding beneath his tight, thin, grayed flesh, raw skin, and wounds that were in varied stages of healing. He looked truly horrifying, but what alarmed me the most were his impossibly deep black voids for eyes. They were all too familiar. I turned to stare at Derek, unsure of quite what to say, as a million realizations crossed my mind. He started to speak again. "I didn't want the residents to hurt him, Kat. When he gets inside, this form is revealed, and so many tried to hurt him at first. I found myself constantly telling people to ignore the friendly window cleaner in the hope that he would be safe from their fear of the unknown." I'd seen Albert's reaction to anything remotely different, and I couldn't bear Jonathan to face the same from the entire block. It was safer to leave him out here. After all, only someone who sees the good in everyone would let him in and accept him, and those people are 1 in a million. Derek half smiled, knowingly. "Terry," I gulped, finally realizing who the twins' father was. "I didn't know about them. Albert had me trapped below by the time Terry was in school, but the second I saw Ellie with you in that stairwell, I knew that she was family." When I realized that Jonathan's new form was a direct result of my actions, I started to come to terms with the power this place had given me. I embraced it, and I used it. I used it to hide Jonathan from his father, who I discovered had fled to the sealed floors not long after the murder. He never knew what became of his son. That shielding must have transferred when the twins were born. It was why he didn't know they existed. Once Albert had discovered his power, along with all his issues and the isolation he drove himself into, it just twisted him up into the man you knew him as. He made it his mission to know all of the special residents, but he never saw Jonathan again. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, emotion making it a little hard to speak. I wondered if Terry had continued a relationship with the window cleaner and why she had kept so quiet about the twins' dad. I processed the fact that Ellie had not only saved my life, but in doing so, she had killed her own grandfather. I couldn't judge Terry or Derek for their actions. He was right. Love works in mysterious ways. Just as it had when I made my choice regarding Jamie, and when I subsequently accepted that he was gone. "I'm showing you because I think you'll understand, and because I don't want you to spend your life riddled with guilt for Jamie. We all make mistakes. Mine was a big one. But out of it came 2 of the purest creatures to walk this earth, and for that I'm grateful." He smiled again as he thought of Ellie and Eddie. Then he looked me dead in the eyes and spoke again. "It's time I corrected my wrongdoings." Solemnly, he walked towards the doors and slid them open, coming face to face with the monstrous shell of a man holding a squeegee. The window cleaner took a step inside, struggling to move on his bone-thin legs, and stopped, millimeters from Derek's face. I couldn't help it. Despite what I knew, he scared me. The twins had balance. Even in their demonic form, there was a visible person there. Their father didn't resemble a person at all. The visceral reaction he ignited in me further proved Derek's point. People will generally attack what they fear. Had I been alone and let him in, I'd have almost certainly done the same. I watched with bated breath as Derek wrapped his arms around the bag of bones in a warm embrace. I watched as he let out a gentle sob and the window cleaner began to disintegrate into dust before my eyes. "No!" I shouted, hoping there was some other way, a happier solution, knowing full well that there wasn't. There was a heavy quiet in the room for a few moments. "It was no life, Kat. I was cruel to let it continue as long as I did," Derek responded, turning to me. Although similar to the way that I had watched my love disappear on our bedroom floor, Derek's action wasn't filled with malice. It was done for the sake of mercy. Derek came towards me and hugged me. I felt emotionally and physically battered, fragile. and my ears continued to ring, but regardless, with him free and with me, I felt safe. Life in the block could finally begin, with no more dark secrets hanging over me. Amongst all the death and chaos, there was joy to be found. "It's over now. A new chapter," he whispered into my ear as I sobbed tears of relief into his shoulder, and the 3 cats played at our feet. Days passed and normality started to resume. I broke lockdown in order to give Terry some rest and spend some time with the twins. It was the least of all my sins throughout this time. It took a lot of explaining and apologizing, but she eventually came round and forgave me for endangering her kids. It sounds simple when put like that, and I'm sure parents reading this would deem me unforgivable. But their kids aren't Ellie and Eddie, and there aren't many folk out there as forgiving and loyal as Terry. I haven't broached the subject of their paternity to her. I'm not sure I ever will, but I hope that one day she'll feel comfortable enough to volunteer the information herself. I continue to pick items up for Mr. Prentice and take money to Carmilla at the Gnome. I'm looking forward to a drink there when this is all over, although I'm sure Mr. P will drink me under the table. The kittens are happy and growing every day. Truth be told, I think Mr. Meow looks badass with his missing leg, especially knowing the heroism it symbolizes. Things had started to look so positive that I almost forgot where I lived. I'd been in such a daze of relief that I hadn't noticed that the stairs had skipped floor 5 from the moment we returned from the undertower. I probably would have gone longer in blissful ignorance if I hadn't have found myself on that floor earlier today. The black sign was much the same as the one on the floors below that had sported a minus symbol before it. Thankfully, however, the artificial light that plagued those floors was nowhere to be seen, and sunlight poured in. I smiled when I first saw the sign, prepared myself to greet the man with a new name. But he wasn't there. His absence was a reminder that no matter how many tribulations I may have conquered, living here there would always be another just around the corner. Instead of the man without a name, in his place was the woman, Angela. My son's camera monitor alerted in the middle of the night. I checked it and saw my wife and son sitting on the bed. They weren't my wife and son. I'm a nurse, and I currently work nights. It's a total drag, but I'm hopeful I can go to days soon, since some coworkers are planning retirements. Anyway, I was working one night when just after 3 a.m., my son's monitor alerted me to sound and movement. No big deal at all. He probably coughed loudly or sneezed or something. He's 3 now, so he generally sleeps all night. I bring it up on my phone, and I see him and my wife sitting on the bed. Again, no big deal. He might have cried out or gotten scared or something. I was about to close the app when I noticed they were acting strange, almost creepy. And when I say almost creepy, I mean creepy as balls. They were sitting on the bed together, both of them just staring up at the camera with blank, emotionless stares. The night vision is black and white, so they had white, eerie-looking eyes. They didn't move at all aside from their visible breathing. They just sat there staring at the camera. I close the app and give my wife a call to make sure everything is okay. I never get to call home on lunch, so in a way this is kind of nice to get to talk to my family while at work. It rings a couple times before she answers with a very groggy, "Hello?" It was like she was dead asleep when I called, and she looked wide awake when on the camera. "Hey, you guys okay?" "Huh? Yeah. Buddy," my son's nickname, came in like 15 minutes ago. Seemed scared, so I said he could sleep with Mama. I'm confused here since I saw them in his room a minute ago. Literally 60 seconds had passed since I closed the app and made the call. "Wait, so you guys are in bed?" "Yeah, I fell back asleep right away. Everything okay?" "Everybody keeps waking me up." She's kind of annoyed. "Hang on a sec." I put her on speaker and bring up the app, hoping I don't see it. When the app loads, I get that pang of intense nervousness in my stomach that I haven't had in a long time, since I was a kid in school and realized while I was eating breakfast, a paper or something was due that day and I hadn't done it. My heart leaps into my throat. My wife and son are sitting on his bed looking up at the camera, same emotionless stares. "Hello? You guys are in bed, right?" "Yeah, we're trying to sleep." "Well, I'm looking at his camera and I see you two sitting on his bed." Huh? Number, we're in our bed. I know that's what you mean, but I'm looking at his bed and you two are in there. Hang on, she says. She's quiet for a sec while she brings up the camera on her phone. I hear this guttural, terrified gasp, like she had sucked all the air in the room into her lungs, filling them to capacity. I don't hear this kind of gasp from my wife often, usually only when she's truly afraid, like during a jump scare in a movie, or one time when we turned her back on our son for literally a second, and he was down by the mailbox inches from the road. I hear rustling of sheets and the line goes dead. Of course, now I'm absolutely terrified myself, so I immediately call back. It goes to voicemail, so I call again. I call again and again with no answer. Finally, after about 4 minutes, she calls me. I tell you that 4 minutes felt like 40 years. Hey, what's happening? I ask. She's absolutely hysterical and crying. I can't understand a word she says. Stop. Slow down for just a second, I say. She slows down enough to explain they are in the car and driving to her parents'. She looked at the camera, and when she saw what was on it, she got up and grabbed our son and rushed downstairs and out the door. Didn't even close the garage. Don't worry about it, I said. I'll drive by when I get off and close it. We live in a generally safe neighborhood, so I'm not too concerned the door is up. You will not go in there, she says. Hell no, I return. Why are we on the camera? She asked. Is it a recording? I don't know, I return. I'm going to keep watching it and see if there's anything I can tell. Do our code words with Buddy. We have code words because we're nerds. We've seen too many pod people and imposter movies, so we decided a long time ago to make code words with each other to be able to tell if one of us was an imposter. We have a couple code words, but we also have a 3-sentence story we recite together, each saying a different part alternately of each other. I hear her on the phone saying the things we taught our son. He giggles as he says them. He does every time we practice, since he thinks they're a joke and doesn't have any idea of the real meaning. We're both convinced he's our son. My wife then says our part, and I'm convinced she's her. We made up these words as a complete joke to ourselves. I never once in my life ever imagined we'd actually need them. Unreal. She got to her parents safely, and it was hard to hang up. I told her we'll figure it out in the morning, hopefully just a glitch. She said she didn't think it was a glitch. When she was running out, she had to run by our son's room and the door was open. There's a little flashing light on the back of the camera that indicates it's connected to the internet. It gives off just enough light that when she ran by, she thought she saw, out of the corner of her eye, a shadowy outline of what could have been an adult sitting on our son's bed. It sends chills down my spine to think about. Knowing they were safe and out of the house is the only thing that kept me at work that night. It was a long 4 hours, but I kept checking the camera every chance I got. Sure enough, they were still sitting on the bed, staring up at the camera with emotionless gazes. I studied them to see if I could see any pattern, from their breathing to their blinking. Their breathing was steady and looked normal. It was their blinking that would tell me if this was just some kind of bizarre, time-looped freak accident video or not. I intently stare at my phone and count the seconds between each blink, telling myself if this is a loop, then their blinks should be even and occur at the same time each time. There was no pattern to their blinking. It was erratic and random, just as a person blinking should be. The passing hours are what finally sealed the deal that this was not a weird looped video of some kind. My son's window is visible on camera, and I can see on camera that it is getting lighter outside his room. His curtains keep out just enough light to prevent the camera from exiting night vision, but lets in just enough to be able to tell the sun is rising. I try to figure out what the hell I'm going to do before I leave work. Calling the police comes to mind, but I talk myself out of it. First of all, what am I supposed to say? Someone is in my house that looks like my wife but isn't. Worse yet, what if they are entities of some kind and the police do go over and it kills them or something? I decide to tell coworker about it. He's a firm believer in the paranormal and might have a suggestion. I show him the video and tell him the story. His initial response of, "That's creepy as fuck," doesn't help much, but he says he wants to go over and check it out. He says we both should, to see if not my wife will try and act like my wife. I tell him absolutely not, and he says we should at least go to the house even if we don't go in. I agree on that since I wanted to close the garage. We got to my house and walked around the perimeter first. Not sure what we wanted to accomplish by that, but it felt like something we should do. The curtains were all drawn since nobody was there to open them in the morning, so we couldn't see anything. I went to close the garage and suddenly had this overwhelming urge to go inside and investigate. It was like I just had to know what was going on. So in we went. We walked through the kitchen towards the foyer where the stairs are. It's so quiet in our house right now, you could hear a feather drop, forget the pin. We stop at the bottom of the stairs and wait a few seconds. I look at the camera again and they are still sitting there. I've never been so scared in my life. My coworker puts his foot on the first step and I suddenly say, "Stop," loudly. "Forget this. We're out of here," I tell him. "Come on." I start making my way back to the kitchen. We hear a loud creak in the floor from upstairs. It's my son's room. He has a very loud, creaky board right in the middle of his floor that's almost impossible not to step on. My wife and I are still deciding if we ever want to fix it because it will alert us if he's ever up to no good when he gets older trying to sneak out or something. "Come on, come on, come on," I yell as I motion for him to move his ass. We're out of the house in about 2 seconds. Out on the street, I check my phone. Now only Not My Son was sitting on the bed, same blank stare. Not My Wife was gone. Holy shit, my coworker says. That was stupid as fuck of us. Do not tell my wife we went inside. She would be so ungodly mad if she found out what we just did. I use my garage door opener in my car to close the door. Before we leave, I look at the camera again. Not My Wife is back on the bed with Not My Son, both staring blankly up at the camera, blinking every few seconds. That was all about 4 days ago now. Not My Wife and Not My Son are still sitting on the bed staring up at the camera. They haven't moved a millimeter. We obviously haven't gone back to our house. What do we do? I'm sorry it's taken so long. It's been an emotional month. I've felt like I'm losing my mind, or already lost it. I've been in the hospital for 3 weeks. You'll remember I left off at my wife's parents' house, not sure what the hell to do. My wife and I argued about it. My in-laws said, "Call the priest." I told my wife we're calling the cops, and that's it. The day we finally called the cops would be day 6. Not My family was still sitting on the goddamn bed staring at the camera. I told the dispatcher there were intruders in my house, leaving out the part where they looked exactly like my family. I told her we were out of the house, but I would meet the police there. She dispatched 2 units. My wife begged me not to go. I told her I had to be there. I had a foolproof plan. I would take her mom's iPhone and FaceTime with my wife while showing the police the camera on my phone. They would see this as a fucked up situation and hopefully proceed with caution. My coworker friend said he would come with me as well. My friend and I beat the cops to my house. Like most of you mentioned in the comments previously, I was packing heat. I have a concealed carry, so I had my 1911.45 on me. I was not concerned this would bother the cops, as I was going to inform them of my permit and that I was currently carrying. What I wasn't going to tell them was that I had my father-in-law's AR-15 in my trunk. It's almost funny how many of you mentioned that was the way to go in my previous entry. I didn't plan on telling the cops about it because I was not planning on needing it. They would come armed and prepared. They showed up, and I let them know I was armed, and then enacted my plan. I initially told them the story. They looked at each other like I was crazy, and they didn't believe me. I FaceTimed my wife so they could see she was in fact not in the house despite what our camera was showing. They still didn't seem to believe me, but this did pique their interest. I hung up with my wife and told her I'd call her back as soon as we knew something. "So now we're sure this isn't a recording," an officer stated, repeating what I said. "It's not. The day-night cycle has changed every day. Their blinking is erratic and not cyclical like it was a repeat," I said. "I know it's a stupid question, but your wife isn't a twin?" the other officer asked. I told him no. My friend spoke up. "I have an idea. Turn the volume up, I'll go throw a pebble at the window." He went around back while I turned up the volume to the max. "Okay, I'm tossing." We heard the light tick sound from outside, but the 1-second delay on the camera came in loud and clear through my phone. Not My Wife moved at the sound of the pebble hitting the window. The first time I'd actually seen her move aside from the time she wasn't on screen, when I initially went inside our house the first day. She turned her head towards the window just slightly, before turning back to the camera. "Okay, so this is live," an officer said. "Okay, sir, I need you and your friend to stay outside here. We're going to go in and find out what's going on here." "Should you ask for more units?" I asked hopefully. "Not at this time. We're going to assess the situation first. They don't appear to be armed, but we're going to be cautious." I opened the garage for them and they made their way in towards my kitchen door. They radioed dispatch that they were headed in and to stand by. They disappeared into my house. A few seconds after they went in, the camera went out. I wanted to vomit and I felt like if I put my fingers in my mouth, I'd be able to feel my heart since it had leapt so far up into my throat. "Shit!" I yelled to my friend. I immediately popped the trunk and got my rifle out and ran into the garage, my friend right behind me. We got inside just in time to hear a low, guttural howl from upstairs, demonic sounding almost, along with raised voices from the police. There were several shots. "Need backup. Shots fired." He was cut off. "Oh my God!" my friend howled. He was scared shitless, but so was I. "God fucking damn it, I knew it," I said, running up the stairs. "My son's room is the first one you come to after getting upstairs, so his wall is also what you see as you walk up the stairs." As I reached the top, I laid into the wall with my rifle. It has a 30-round magazine, but I felt like I fired 100 shots. I fired all over the place, knowing full well the ammo would go through the wall like it was paper, concentrating on where my son's bed would be, but also near the door and towards the floor as well in case whatever these things were thought to duck. We heard shrieks of pain coming from the room, then nothing. My friend and I paused for a minute before deciding to go in because the camera was still out. We heard a whimpering coming from the room. There was a dead cop in the hallway we had to step over. It was awful, and I'll never be able to unsee it. His head was several feet away from his body in the threshold to our guest room. We found the other cop in my son's room right inside the doorway. He had several large holes in his torso, as if he'd been impaled. Exactly what I was afraid would happen had happened. I called the cops, and whatever these things were killed them. When we entered the room, we found the source of the whimpering was not my wife. She was laying on her back on the floor, holding her torso that was bullet-ridden and breathing heavy. The scene was awful. I can hardly put into words how awful it was. I know now, just like I did then, they weren't my family. It shouldn't have been hard. I should have been able to just go in and finish it. But instead I fell to my knees. Not my wife begged for her life. "I don't want to die, honey," she whimpered. "I wanted to have more kids. I can't die now." I looked over at not my son, who had to be dead. He'd taken 2 shots at least to the head, or what was left of it. He had several more in his torso and 1 or 2 on his legs and arms. If you have kids, seeing their lifeless, bullet-ridden body is a special kind of hell. Again, I knew it wasn't my son, but it was. I was going to be sick. I'd killed my family. I turned back to not my wife. She was acting just like my wife. It even mimicked her anxiety about death that she has had in the past year or so. "It's not her, man." I forgot my friend was even there. "It's not her. Shoot it." I know what you guys are thinking. How many times has this happened in the movies, and you scream at your TV for the main character to just shoot the imposter because it's not their loved one? I guess movies get it right somehow. I'll never roll my eyes at the character who can't kill an imposter again. "Please don't shoot me," it begged. My hands were shaking as I aimed at it. Why couldn't I do it? I knew, this wasn't my wife. "Listen, man," my friend began calmly. "Look at it. Its blood is yellow. It's not your family." Was it yellow? It was. Seeing my family slain was so traumatic I hadn't even noticed their blood wasn't red. I steadied my aim, and not my wife suddenly stopped begging. She began that guttural, terrifying shriek, and something black or gray started to protrude from her mouth, like a tentacle or something, and I fired. At that range, her head more or less exploded. Whatever these things were, they appeared to be mortal. I was still on my knees and my friend was out in the hallway just outside the door. We heard the sounds of approaching police sirens. I'd forgotten one of the cops had gotten a shots fired call over the radio before being killed. It seemed like it had been hours, but it had only been about 5 minutes since the police had gone in. My friend went downstairs to let the police know what to expect. I stood up and slowly made my way into the hallway. I was lightheaded and felt like I was going to be sick. My bedroom is adjacent to my son's, so the doorway is about a foot to the right of my son's doorway. My door was closed, but as I exited my son's room, my door opened. Not Me walked out into the hallway, wearing exactly the same thing I was at that time. I was shocked in place. I couldn't move, but it did. It walked towards me, and its right arm turned black and morphed into what appeared to be a tentacle. It was wiggling around like a squid or octopus appendage. When he thrust his arm at me, it solidified and impaled me through my abdomen. It then stabbed me in the left leg just above the kneecap. I fell to the ground in pain. Its tentacle arm was wiggling again. "Why did you kill my family?" it asked. When it spoke, its voice changed pitch several times. It was my voice, then much deeper, then normal again. It alternated several times, saying that one sentence. It moved in closer. The rifle was gone, but I still had my .45. I pulled it out and got a shot off in its right knee. It howled. As Not Me fell to his knee, I fired a couple more shots, getting 2 into its abdomen and left side of its ribs. It breathed heavily for a few seconds before I used the last of my strength to aim proper and shot Not Me in the face. Its blood was also yellow. I lay there bleeding out, thinking this was it for sure. I still had some strength from adrenaline kicking in, so I took my belt off and tried to make a tourniquet for my leg. With my stomach wound, it was hard to give it a good yank to tighten it. I then took my shirt off and balled it up and packed my stomach wound and applied as much pressure as I could. Being a nurse probably saved my life. I passed out, but the measures I took must have kept me alive long enough for EMS to arrive. I heard raised voices and the sound of pounding coming up the stairs before I went out. It was probably a cop, but I felt pressure from somebody trying to keep my wound packed before I went out. I was in and out of consciousness as EMS arrived, along with probably every cop in the city. I was wheeled downstairs and put in an ambulance, but while I was being loaded onto the gurney upstairs, I heard cops freaking out, and rightfully so. They'd lost 2 brothers and there were 3 other bodies. Did he kill his brother? Are they twins? Probably referring to Not Me's dead body. Or his whole family? Put him on armed guard while at the hospital. He'll probably be getting charged. As I was getting placed into the ambulance, I saw my friend talking to a group of about 10 cops, all listening very intently to what he was saying. I went out again in the ambulance. I woke up in the ER. My wounds had been treated. The tentacle hadn't been more than a few inches wide, so it was just slightly larger than a large knife. They'd sewn me up, and I found that I was currently receiving a blood transfusion due to blood loss at my home. My wife had authorized them to do whatever they had needed while I was unconscious. She was also extremely pissed that I went in the house. We're okay now, but that's a story for another day. I was in the hospital for 3 weeks since I ended up getting an infection and almost went septic. I needed quite a few antibiotics. For the entire 3 weeks, I had cops in my room with questions. After about a week, they released me and no longer had me under armed guard. I told them absolutely everything, not caring if it made sense or not, and thank God my friend had come with me since he was able to corroborate this weird story. Midway through my hospital stay, men with suits came to pay me a visit. They were government, I knew right away. They said they were FBI, but I don't know if I believe that. They wanted to talk about not my family. The police chief and the coroner were involved, and it was very hush-hush. They made it clear this was not to get out to the public. This is where I have to apologize probably for an anticlimactic ending to this ordeal. I don't know what Not Me and my family were, neither do they. The only thing we know is that they were sentient creatures that looked like us and had yellow blood. I begged the coroner to tell me about their autopsies, but he said he wasn't allowed to say. He must have felt bad for me, since I received a bouquet of flowers a couple days later. The card inside the envelope read, "We don't know what they are. They have the same organs we do, but in different parts of their body aside from their brain, but what's red and pink inside us is green and yellow inside them. They're humanoid creatures, but whatever they aren't human. The government thinks they may be extraterrestrial. Destroy this letter ASAP. We had our house professionally cleaned. It was almost surely a government team since they contacted us on behalf of the police. We could not find any Google reviews or website for the company online. My wife and I are not going to go back to our house. We would love to burn it down, but there's no way to do that and avoid suspicion of arson at this point. We'll end up taking a huge loss on the property since everyone in our neighborhood knows there was an incident involving multiple deaths in the house but don't know what actually happened. It'll be hard to sell, but eventually it will. We're going to move on from here. I told everyone at work it was a home invasion and they bought it. I'll go back to work in a couple weeks and we'll start looking for a new house. Again, I'm sorry. I know everyone wanted a concrete ending and to know exactly what the fuck those things were, but we just don't know. Alien sounds good to me. I've been thinking if they were supernatural or actual demons, gunfire wouldn't have been able to kill them. It's just hard to say. If they were aliens, why did they just sit there and creep in our house for a week? They didn't even try to take over our lives. It's hard to wrap my head around. If it is aliens, keep your eyes peeled out there. There could be more of them. One of the topics that I get asked about a lot, here and in real life, involve things like the rake, the wendigo, and other related legends. I can't honestly say that I know a lot about any of them, but based on some light reading I did, I can say that I've heard stories that seem to be loosely related to them. You've heard the old adage that legends like that come from somewhere, and I'm sure that's true, but as you all know, I do try to take things with a grain of salt. You have to, out here. It's sort of like working in a hospital, I'd imagine. You could spend all day thinking about how many people have died there, and how there are probably ghosts, or whatever you want to call them, all over the place, but it doesn't do you any good. It just makes it harder to do your job. I think a lot of us feel that way, and that's why we try to just go about our work like everything is fine. Once you get paranoid, there's not really any going back, and a lot of cadets quit because of it. My park especially seems to have a high turnover rate because the cadets graduate and get so freaked out about everything, and they can't seem to let it go. You have to learn to internalize things and shut off. I've talked to KD a bit about her experience because I wanted to know what she thought about the Wendigo. She didn't really have anything in particular to say about it. Aside from that, she didn't want to think about it that much. But she told me a friend of hers had had something similar happen. I contacted this person, H, over Skype, and they agreed to talk to me a bit. They're aware of my work here, and they're fine with me posting the story exactly as they wrote it. I grew up in Central Oregon, and there's a reservation called Warm Springs about 2 or so hours from where I lived. I only mention that because a lot of people in my area have friends there, and a lot of the land in that area belongs to that tribe. When I was a kid, we used to go camping up there. Not on the res, of course, but in that area, and I met a lot of kids who grew up there. I got to know one kid really well. His name was Nolan, and we ended up hanging out a lot when our families were in the area. Our folks got to know each other, so we'd all get in touch and camp out around the same time. We'd camp for about 2 weeks, so we were out there for a long time. I asked him if he camped in an RV. Yeah, my dad had one, so I guess it wasn't really camping, but we'd take our tents and stuff and set them up out away from camp most nights. I didn't like sleeping in there because I like being outside. We talked for a bit about camping. So anyway, sorry. One year, Nolan and I were out there. I think we must have been like 12 or so. We wanted to go out and camp near the river because we wanted to try night fishing. I think we must have been about 1/3 of a mile from the main camp. Far enough away that we couldn't hear or see anyone else. I remember that. We were messing around most of the day. I don't really remember much about it. But we ended up building a fire at some point. And I was really impressed because he had this flint or something that he used to start it. I'd never seen anyone do that before, so I thought it was pretty cool. I got him to teach me how to do it. And we lit some stuff on fire, which looking back was really stupid because it was the middle of fucking summer. And if I remember right, the fire warning was either at yellow or orange. But thankfully we didn't start anything major. And when it got dark, we sat around and talked about whatever it is 12-year-olds talk about. I don't really remember. What I do remember is that at some point, he looked over my shoulder at the river and asked me if I could see something. The way our camp was set up, we were about 10 feet from the river, and we were at the widest point, so it was probably about 20 feet to the other bank. It gets hot up there in the summer, but the water's still cold, which is important. I look over my shoulder, and I could see something wading into the river on the other side. From where we were, it looked like a deer, but we couldn't really tell because of the fire. I got up to look closer, and I saw a pair of antlers, so I figured it was a buck. But I thought it was weird that it was wading into the water, and it was definitely heading for us, and I asked Nolan what he thought we should do. He's looking at the fire with this weird expression, and he tells me to sit down and shut up, so I do, because I'd never seen him act that way before. He's whispering at me to ignore it, and to just keep talking like we were, but I couldn't think of anything to say. He was saying something about an episode of some show, but I could hear the deer coming through the water, so I wasn't really paying any attention, and I kept trying to see over his shoulder. But every time I did, he'd sort of hit me on the arm and make me look at him. I wasn't really scared, I remember. I was just sort of confused. But then, I hear the deer come out of the water, and I could kind of make out what it looked like, and I realized it wasn't a deer because whatever it was walking on two legs. I started to get up. I was super freaked out, but Nolan just yanked me back down and talked louder about this television show, and I could tell he was just as scared as I was, probably even more. He leaned in and poked the fire with a stick, and he whispered that whatever I do, I can't speak to it. I could see it come closer, and it stood right behind Nolan's back. I was about ready to pee my pants, and I think I'd probably have run if I'd been alone. But I didn't want to leave Nolan, so I kept sitting really still and sneaking glances at it. It wasn't that tall, but the way it carried itself was just wrong, like its center of balance was screwed up. I can't really describe it, but it was kind of like it kept shifting too far forward. It just stood there behind Nolan for a long time, and eventually Nolan ran out of things to say, and we just kind of sat there for a second. The fire was making noise, but I thought I could hear this thing talking in a really low voice. I couldn't hear what it was saying, and I leaned forward a tiny little bit, and I actually did pee my pants when it leaned forward too. I couldn't see its face, but I saw its eyes. They were cloudy and milky, and if you want to know what they looked like, find that scene from Lord of the Rings, where Frodo falls in that lake, and all the dead people are floating toward him. That's what its eyes looked like, so all I saw were these two white eyes floating above Nolan's head, and the really vague shape of the antlers coming out of its head. I don't know what my face looked like, but at exactly the same time, Nolan and I fucking booked it out of there, and we ran non-stop until we got back to the main camp. My pants were soaked with pee, so I took them off as we were running and threw them in the bushes. We both stopped once we were in front of my dad's RV, and we couldn't see anything chasing us, so we stood there and caught our breath. I asked him what that thing was, but he said he didn't know. He said his grandpa had only warned him that if anything ever came up to him when he was out in the desert, he was never ever supposed to talk to it or listen to anything it had to say. I wanted to know if he'd heard it talking too, and he said that the only thing he'd been able to understand was, "Help you." I think we ended up sleeping in the RV with my parents, and the next night we went back out and didn't see anything. That does remind me in a lot of ways of the Wendigo legend. There's a phrase used to describe it that I think fits perfectly, which is that the Wendigo is the spirit of the lonely places. I know sometimes when I'm out in the wilds where I know there's no one around me for miles and miles, I get this weird kind of craving that I can't really explain. I don't know if it happens to anyone else, but it's this desire to consume. It's not like I crave anything in particular, but more of this weird, distracting hunger that comes from every part of my gut. I also wanted to find out more about the faceless man if I was able, and found a few similar things. I asked around my circle of friends, and one of them said when he was out doing repairs at a park in his area, he saw something kind of like that. We were having dinner in town, 5 of us including myself. This guy, he was repainting an information booth and heard a man ask him for directions to the nearest campsite. He didn't turn around because he was up on a ladder, but he informed the man that there weren't any campsites nearby, but that if he headed down the road about 4 miles, he'd find one at another park. He asked if he could be of any other help, but the man said no and thanked him. My friend said he kept painting, but he was listening and never heard the man leave. The second he came up and talked to me, the hairs on my neck stood up, but I wasn't sure why. I just had this really uneasy feeling about the whole thing, and I wanted to finish painting and get out of there. I figured maybe part of it was that I couldn't turn around to look at him, but something just felt off. There was also this weird smell floating around even before the guy talked to me, kind of like old period blood. I had looked around to see what was causing it, but I didn't find anything. So I waited for the guy to walk away, but I didn't hear him leave, which made me think he was just standing there and watching me. So I asked again if I could do anything for him, and he didn't answer. I knew he was there, though, because I hadn't heard him leave, so I did this awkward turn on the ladder to look down and see what he was doing. Now I admit it could have just been my brain fucking up, but I swear to you, Russ, for a split second when I turned around, that fucker didn't have a face. Like he had no face. It was almost concave and totally smooth, and I just about had a fucking heart attack because I couldn't even wrap my brain around what I was seeing. I think I started to say something, but there was this kind of pop inside my head, and suddenly he was just a normal-looking guy. I must have looked weird because he asked me if I was okay, and I was just like, yeah, I'm fine. He asks about the campsite again, and I point to where he has to go, and he's like, I'm not from around here, can you help me get there? Now this is when I know something is really up, because there's no way this guy got out here and didn't know where he was. And for that matter, there's no car around, so how'd he get here in the first place? I said I was sorry, but that I couldn't take him anywhere in a company vehicle, and he's like, please? I really don't know where I am, can you come with me and help me get there? So now I'm seriously weirded out, and I start wondering if this is some kind of ambush or whatever. I told him I could call him a taxi to come out and take him where he wants to go, and I pull out my phone and he just goes no and walks away really quickly. But he doesn't walk out of the park, he walks back into the fucking trees, and I got right in my fucking truck and start to get out of there, fuck the paint or whatever. I looked in my mirror to see where he was as I was leaving, and he was standing right at the tree line again. I don't know how he got there so fast, but this time I know that fucker didn't have a face. He was just watching me leave, and right before I turned the corner, he took a big step back into the trees and kind of dissolved, I guess. Maybe it was just dark so he blended in, but it felt more like he just melted away. Interestingly, right after this guy finished his story, someone else piped up with another one, but with a slightly different twist. You know, actually, I had something sort of weird like that happen a while back. I was out doing some trail scouting, and I was out in the middle of nowhere figuring out where we were going to have this trail run through. I hadn't seen anyone else for probably a good 2 hours, so I wasn't really paying attention to where I was going. I was just looking at the ground for the most part. Then out of nowhere, I crested this little hill and almost ran into this guy. He was older, probably in his 60s, and I started to apologize to him for running into him. And then I noticed his face, and I probably looked like a complete douchebag because I stopped and just stared at him. It took me a second to figure out what was wrong, but this guy's face was huge. I know that sounds weird, but that's the only way I can describe it. His head wasn't big or anything, it was normal, but the amount of space his face took up was just way too much. Like if you took someone's face and enlarged it all by about 2 times. He doesn't say anything, he just kind of looks at me. And I backed up and was kind of stuttering and saying I was sorry, and I went around him and fucking got out of there and did what I needed to do. The whole time I kept looking behind me because I was so freaked out that he'd pop up behind me or something. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I swear to you it was one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. I switched the topic to the stairs a little later, and there was a definite shift in enthusiasm. No one spoke up at first. There's a real stigma around discussing them even when we're away from work. But I broke the ice with a story of my own. And the guy who told the story about the faceless man told this one, albeit very quietly. A couple years ago, I was camping with my girlfriend, and we're out about 2 miles from the road at this site I know. We went to bed that night, but we couldn't sleep because someone interjected a funny comment, and we were dangerously close to going off on another subject. But I got us back on track. Yeah, really funny, you fucker. No, it was because we kept hearing that grinding noise. My brother used to grind his teeth in his sleep, and it kind of reminds me of that. My girlfriend was freaking out, but I just kept telling her to ignore it because I've heard it before and you just have to ignore it. It goes away eventually, you guys know what I mean. We all knew what he meant. So eventually I got her to go to sleep, but I woke up probably 2 hours later because something was just off. I rolled over and she wasn't there, and I kind of freaked out because he thought for a second and then he took a very long drink. Anyway, I ran out of the tent calling her name, but I didn't have to go far. She was standing at the edge of the camp looking at something in the trees, and I could see she was really pale. The fire was low but bright enough to see her. Anyway, so I ran up to see what was going on, and she was dead asleep, but her eyes were open. She had this real spaced out look, you know. So I put my arm around her to lead her back, but she wouldn't move. She just said really quietly something like, "I have to go now, Eddie. I have to go, it's here." I was like, "You're just sleepwalking, come back to bed." But she wouldn't budge. She just kept standing there and saying that she had to go. And I looked where she was looking, and there was a fucking staircase right there about 15 yards away. Gray one, concrete. And she started to walk toward it, but I yanked her back, and that woke her up. She looked at me like I was fucking out of my mind, and she asked what the fuck she was doing out of the tent. I didn't tell her anything, I just told her she was sleepwalking. The grinding was gone, so she just went back to the tent with me and fell asleep again. I don't know. I don't like thinking about it, you know? We all knew. You guys remember that kid with, I can't remember what it was, some kind of brain fuck up, not Downs, but something like it. Someone else brought up, well, I got to read the report he gave when they found him a week after he went missing, and it was fucked up beyond belief. I mean, you have to take it with a grain of salt because who knows what that kid actually thinks is real, but some of this stuff, I don't think he could have made up. Like what? Well, first of all, he talked about the stairs. He said he'd been watching his dad build a fire and the stairs came up to him, and he had to go up them or something bad would happen. The cops couldn't really understand what he was talking about after that because he just kept saying, like the campfire, over and over. And he kept mentioning sounds, but he couldn't say what sounds, just that it was loud and he covered his ears so he couldn't hear them. But the thing I remember most is that they asked him where exactly he'd gone, and he just said he was right there. He kept pointing at himself, and they said they thought that meant that he thought he'd never left. He said he wasn't scared because the stairs were there, and he said they talked to him, but not like people talk. Like I said, it was really convoluted and hard to understand, and I have a feeling the cops didn't take most of it down. They ended up just saying that the kid had some kind of amnesia or fugue, and that they didn't think foul play was involved. Doesn't really explain why he came back a week later perfectly fine without a speck of dirt on him and well fed, but hey, what the cops say goes. My sleep paralysis demon is actually a pretty chill guy. My first memory of sleep paralysis happened when I was 10 years old. I remember because it was the night my parents took me to see Shrek 2 for getting good marks on my report card. It was an evening show, so we got in late and my mom tucked me straight into bed when we got home. It was around 4 a.m. when I woke up. The light from my alarm clock told me that much. I couldn't feel anything, not my pajamas against my skin, or the warmth of my head against the pillow. I could feel my arms and legs, but they felt heavy, as if a great weight was holding them down. I tried to call out, but I couldn't. My voice caught in my throat, my lips unable to move. I mustered a weak groan that sounded like a cross between a frog's croak and a zombie's moan, but that was it. I thought I was dead, that this is what death feels like, being awake but unable to move or tell anyone. My mind wrestled with the idea of being placed in a coffin, unable to tell anyone I was still alive in here, unable to move or say anything as the lid closed and they put me in the ground, still alive. My fear subsided as I felt my heart thudding in my chest in response to my near panic attack. I also became aware of my breathing, which slowed as the fear subsided. I calmed a little, thinking it was just a dream. That was when I saw him for the first time. Mr. Brownsticklegs. He huddled in the corner of the room by my closet. His two oversized red eyes glowed in the dark of my bedroom. His face was like a porcelain mask, white, expressionless, with no mouth or nose, only those two haunting red eyes. When he stood up, his body unfolded like origami until his head reached the ceiling. His neck bent, tilting forward as his true height was greater than the height of my room. His long black torso was covered in shimmering symbols that reflected red in the light of his glowing eyes. He stood on two spindly, thin legs that disappeared into the shadows of the room. He made no noise as he moved, seeming to glide as he hovered closer to my bed. His long, thin arms reached down to me as I moaned through paralyzed lips. I could not scream, even though I very much wanted to. His fingers reaching through the darkness, down to my face. Two pointed fingers touched against my eyelids, pushing them closed. I remember his fingertips feeling cool, but not cold. Even though the ends of his fingertips looked sharp, his touch was gentle. "Do not struggle, little one. Sleep, sleep," he said. His voice was so deep I could feel it in my chest when he spoke. I did as instructed, convincing myself that it indeed was a dream. Even if it wasn't, the back of my eyelids was more reassuring than looking into those piercing red eyes and his vacant mask of a face. I closed my eyes, wanting it to be a dream, willing it to be a dream. I woke up the next morning, thankfully able to move, walk, and talk. I explained what I saw to my parents, who both agreed that it was a dream. My mom tried floating the idea that something from Shrek 2 scared me, but neither my dad or I bought it. For confirmation, Dad asked that I draw a picture of what I saw for them. As I was drawing, I ran out of black crayon and had to finish his legs with the next darkest color in my crayon box. "Hey there, Mr. Brown Sticklegs," my dad said as I handed him the drawing. "You leave my daughter alone now, you hear?" This is how my sleep paralysis demon ended up with the name Mr. Brown Sticklegs. Giving him a silly name helped take some of the edge off of going to bed the following night. My dad even did a sweep of the room, calling out for him. "Here, Mr. Brown Sticklegs," he said, whistling as if he were calling a dog. It made me giggle, and the whole episode felt more fun than scary. But once they tucked me in and turned off the light, I felt the dread creeping back in. Darkness hits harder when you expect to find something lurking in the shadows. I don't know how long I searched, but I eventually fell asleep. In the weeks following, I searched for Mr. Brown Sticklegs every night as I fell asleep. Even when I went to sleepovers, I would do a cursory check in case he tagged along to a friend's house. As time passed, my searches became less frequent. It was a couple months later, the night before my first day of 5th grade, when I woke up to Mr. Brown Sticklegs straddled over my bed, his empty plate of a face inches from my own. A scream stuck in my throat, coming out sounding like a gush of air releasing from a pool float. "Hush, child," he said. His voice was deep, echoless. I didn't know how he spoke without a mouth, but I heard him nonetheless. I saw that he held a piece of paper in his thin fingers, crumpled on the edges and torn. He held it up to show me. On the page was a pink blob with blue dots for eyes and a droll red smile, and stick lines for legs and arms. It was lying on a blue rectangle. "I found the picture you drew of me. So I drew a picture of you," he said. "Do you like it?" I tried nodding, but I couldn't move. I tried answering, but all that came out was the same dry croaking sound. "Will you draw another one for me? I so liked the first one. You gave me pants. I look good in pants." Again, I was unable to respond or move to give him an answer. He must have been able to read my intent because he tucked the picture under my pillow before closing my eyes again. When I woke up in the morning, I bolted upright and tossed my pillow off the bed. My heart leapt into my throat when I found the picture. It wasn't a dream. He was real. I went to my desk and began drawing a picture for him, starting with his face and eyes, trying to capture as much detail as I could remember. I had forgotten all about the first day of school until my mom opened my door and found me still in my pajamas. "Lexi," she yelled, startling me as I was coloring in his eyes. "Your bus will be here in less than an hour. Get dressed now." I tucked my picture into my school backpack and got dressed. I finished my drawing at recess that day, using my brand new Crayola 64 pack that I got with my back-to-school supplies. I gave him blue pants this time, figuring he'd like to see himself in jeans. I wrote his name, Mr. Brown Sticklegs, at the bottom of the picture and drew a smiley face next to it, hoping he'd like his nickname. I flipped the paper over to write him a message on the back. I wanted to ask him questions, but didn't want to anger him since he visited me when I was at my most vulnerable. I wrote out my letter on a separate piece of paper before copying it over to the back of my picture. "Dear Mr. Brown Sticklegs, that's your name. My name is Lexi. I am in the 5th grade. What is your name? How old are you? Do you go to school? Why do you visit my bedroom? Why can't I move when you visit? You look scary, but you also seem nice. I hope we can be friends. Love, Lexi. P.S. I hope you like your blue pants. I added another smiley face at the end of the letter, my final emphasis on wanting to be friends. I considered closing with sincerely, but I figured love was a better, friendlier choice. I tucked the picture under my pillow that night, now anxious to see him rather than filled with dread of his reappearance. But like the last time, he did not return the next day, or the day after. The days stretched into weeks, and every morning I found the picture tucked under my pillow from the night before. It wasn't until Thanksgiving break that I saw him again. My eyes opened as the morning sun poked through the blinds of my bedroom. His body didn't look any different in the light. In fact, his black skin seemed darker, absorbing the sun's rays without giving anything back. His eyes seemed wider than before. If he had a mouth, I would have figured he was smiling. In his slender fingers was the picture I drew for him. "Hello, Lexi," he said. "Thank you for the picture. I do look good in blue pants." I wanted to smile, but, well, sleep paralysis. He flipped the picture over to the side with my letter. "I will answer your questions the best I can. I do not have a name, not one you could ever pronounce, but I am happy for you to call me Mr. Brown Sticklegs. As for my age, I exist outside of the construct of time. Therefore, I am ageless. I do not go to school, nor do I know what school is. Why do I visit you? I visit to feed on the energy of your soul." My breath quickened as a mute groan exited my teeth. I wanted to run, wanted to get away from him, but I was pinned down, unable to move. He sensed my uneasiness and tried to calm me by patting my forehead. "Let me explain. Have you been to the ocean? It appears vast, almost limitless as you stare out into the blue water, with no visible land on the other side." In my mind, I was standing on a beach. I felt the salty ocean breeze against my face as I looked out over the massive body of water. The waves crashed at my feet. I felt the rush of water over them, followed by the trickle of sand and pebbles as the water drew back. "Your soul is like an ocean, child, vast, limitless, undefinable by words to your understanding. I take only a tiny sip, a single glass of water from a vast ocean. I am not one who could consume an entire ocean." Dark clouds formed over the water as I stared at the white-capped waves. The clouds unleashed a heavy downpour, turning the horizon gray as rain fell from the sky over the ocean. Just as the rain falls over the ocean, your soul can replenish itself by more than I could ever consume, not even in 1,000 of your years. Does that make you feel better? On the beach in my mind's vision, I nodded. In my bedroom, he nodded back at me. "Good. As for your last question, why you cannot move, we are meeting at a point outside of your time, where your world and mine touch. Your physical body cannot move here, but if you persist, you can learn to speak to me with your mind, and I will answer your questions in exchange for your drawings. You can draw pictures of whatever you like. I want to know more of your world." In my mind, I nodded again. "This knowledge is a gift so we can understand one another more. I am not one who would hurt you." He pressed his fingertips to my eyelids again, closing them. In my mind's eye, I was still on the beach, but the sun was setting, and no stars were visible through the rain. I drifted back to sleep to the sound of falling rain. The next morning, I asked my parents for a sketchbook and colored pencils. They tried to hold me off until Christmas, but since I spent most of my afternoons and weekends drawing pictures up in my room, Dad let me open one of my gifts a week early, a Strathmore sketchbook with 100 pages with a 50-pack of Crayola-colored pencils. I started by drawing the rest of my family, Mom, Dad, my little brother Tommy, our cat Libby, and even though he had died, our dog Pancakes. Next, I drew our house, then our car, then my school. I kept drawing anything I could think of, trees, birds, insects, until my sketchbook was full. I used my allowance to purchase more books so I could keep drawing. I honed my craft, redoing my earlier drawings in greater detail. My thoughts considered his wording. I am not one who could consume an entire ocean. I wanted to ask him if there were those who could, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to know such things. Mr. Brown Sticklegs didn't return until my freshman year of high school. To him, it wasn't like any time had passed. I read up on lucid dreaming in the time between visits, so that when he returned, I would be better capable of talking to him. He held my book in his hands, flipping through my drawings, doting over the increased refinement of my drawing skills. I had filled a dozen sketch pads and upgraded from Crayola to Prismacolor Premier pencils for my drawings. His biggest surprise was when, after he complimented my drawings, I spoke to him. "Thank you," I said, seeing the words in my mind as I spoke them aloud. If he had a surprised expression, his eyes showed it. "You have been very busy, child," he said. "Do you have any questions you would like to ask?" I hesitated, but finally formed the words in my mind. Are there creatures who can consume an entire ocean? He didn't respond right away, which made me think I had not asked properly. As I asked him a second time, he put a finger to my lips as if to shush me. "There are those who can. They are known as the Dark Ones. They are capable of consuming entire souls, emptying them out, leaving them dry and barren. You should not fear them, but you should also not provoke them." His eyes curved downward as if concerned or afraid. "What do they look like?" I asked. In my mind, my visions were filled with images of great, terrible creatures, spiders taller than the Empire State Building on thin, spindly legs of shadow and smoke, tentacled monsters in the seas lofting blue whales like they were toys, ripping them to shreds with their curved, chitinous beaks, great, ghastly flying creatures that knocked over orchards and forests with the beat of their leathery wings. "I showed you only because you ask," Mr. Brown Sticklegs said. "But it is best that we don't talk or think about them. Let them be." I nodded in my mind. He leaned forward and pressed his plate-like face to my head, as if to kiss me on the forehead, which was odd since he didn't have a mouth. Then, as usual, he closed my eyes and I drifted back to sleep. My life took a downturn during the latter years of high school. My dad lost his job, and when the search for a new one dragged on, he turned to drinking to cope with his failure. He wasn't abusive, but he wasn't fun to be around either. In the months following, my parents would hush their arguing when I entered the room, greeting me with smiles as if nothing were wrong. That lasted until the day I came home from school to them fighting over a foreclosure notice from the bank. We moved out over a weekend from our home in the suburbs to an apartment on the other side of town. I internalized my feelings during that time. I withdrew from my friends and school activities besides the art club, the only one we could still afford. I saw my friends driving to school and hanging out while I rode the bus, too poor and too far out of the way to join in. My tastes began to change as well. Out was the bubblegum pop of Katy Perry, Kaha, and Taylor Swift. Instead, I listened to Pierce the Veil, Sleeping with Sirens, and Bring Me the Horizon. My clothes and makeup became darker, more black t-shirts and skirts with black eyeliner and black fingernail polish. Mom called it my goth phase, not that she understood. My drawings became darker too. I moved from colored pencils to charcoal, drawing skulls and gothic-looking cemeteries as my passion for drawing animals and flowers waned. I also drew the Dark Ones, in great detail, exactly how I remembered them in my mind's eye. Mr. Brown Sticklegs visited me again a month after we moved into the apartment. He looked more at home in my room of black light posters and death metal bands than he did in my previous room. His eyes were dim, not the vibrant red as they were before. He stared at me as I lay in bed, unable to move. He moved inches from my face as I heard his words in my mind. "Your soul tastes different now." He didn't speak of my drawings. I worried that he might, especially since I had been drawing the Dark Ones. Not only drawing them, but thinking about them, and what type of damage they could do if they were to wake. He seemed sad for me, although reading his expression was difficult with no face. He patted my forehead like before, but didn't close my eyes before leaving as he used to. My life continued its spiraling path like a bottle rocket with a broken stick. My parents didn't talk outside of short conversations about which bills to pay and which ones to ignore. Each night, Dad disappeared into a bottle while Mom disappeared online to chat with a male Facebook friend she knew from high school. The thing about rock bottom is that it's often a disguise for a trap door that drops you to an even lower depth than you thought possible. The first bottom came when my father died. Drove off the road into a gravel pit late at night with an empty bottle of bourbon in the passenger seat. I cried, but it felt hollow. I felt hollow. Even when Mom tried to hold me, I felt nothing inside. Not sadness, not guilt, not anything. I disappeared into my sketchbooks, drawing even darker, more disturbing images. Death, dismemberment, vividly accurate vivisections of the cute animals I used to enjoy drawing. My friends no longer talked to me, which was fine because I didn't want to talk to them anymore anyways. I found people to hang out with, not friends, but people who could get me access to moments of chemical-induced euphoria to forget about life for a while. Just like that, the trap door opened, dropping me to a new rock bottom of addiction. One thing I had that in common with my dad, but instead of falling into a bottle, I fell into a needle. I stole money from my mom's purse to feed my habits, not that she noticed. She was busy with her old Facebook friend who had moved from online acquaintance to nightly sleepover companion. When the time came to begin my senior year, I didn't bother going back. I kept drawing, filling entire sketchbooks with the dark images that reflected my bleak outlook on life. The dark ones were prevalent subjects during this period of my life. I drew them feasting on humanity, raking flesh from bone in their jagged teeth behind lips of smoke. I came home one night to find my mom and her new male friend in the middle of a fight. It was different from her fights with Dad, more violent, more physical. When he raised his hand at me for trying to intervene, I decided it was time to bolt. I left home, hitching rides with anyone with a set of wheels I could manage to put up with for short periods of time. My preference leaned toward those with access to the chemical release I craved. The more I could numb, the more I could escape. I found certain drug combinations had similar effects to sleep paralysis, where my mind's ability to control my body's action became severed. In those moments of numbed paralysis, I'd see Mr. Brownsticklegs watching from afar as I dulled the pain. I saw what I perceived as the dark ones too, but they weren't hiding in the shadows like Mr. Brownsticklegs did. They were the shadows. I called out to them as well, for in those moments I wanted nothing more than to be hollowed out and empty, a void so dark no pain could ever penetrate it. When they didn't answer, I called out to Mr. Brownsticklegs, but he would vanish every time. Perhaps it was all just a drug-fueled hallucination. Overdosing was never my intention. I was pushing too much, trying to find the edge of the void after feeling so low, so very low, searching for that something extra to filter out the background noise. I took it too far, giving myself a near-lethal dose. At one moment, I was lying next to strangers on a stained mattress in an abandoned warehouse. Then came the initial rush of euphoric bliss, and then nothing. Whoever I was traveling with at the time dumped me on the curb in front of the ER, making me someone else's problem. This was my rock-bottom moment, although at the time it felt more like free fall. I spent 3 weeks in a coma. I was aware of my surroundings and could hear the doctors and nurses as they checked my vitals and tended to my cleanliness and upkeep, but I couldn't move or speak. At the end of my 3rd week in the ICU on an incubator, I looked up to find Mr. Brownsticklegs hovering over me, his round red eyes peering through the darkness. "What have you done to yourself, child?" His voice spoke inside my mind. In my mind, I was beside him, standing in the middle of a vast salt-flat desert. The ground was cracked and dry in a hexagonal pattern that stretched in all directions. "This is your soul now, there is nothing left to drink." I heard my beep of my heart rate monitor back in my hospital room speed up as fear entered my mind. I called out to the dark ones, I said. I asked for them to come. They emptied me out, emptied my soul. "No, my child, you did this. You have not replenished. You have only consumed. And now nothing remains." I dropped to my knees in the middle of the salt as I felt a rumbling deep inside the hollow pit of my stomach. I leaned forward onto my arms, but they were no longer my arms. They were pitch black and empty. I could feel them, but when I looked at them, they were empty voids of smoke and shadow. I stood up on my legs, but they were no longer my legs. The darkness swirled up my torso and down my arms. The emptiness inside me consumed my entire body until only my head remained. What's happening to me? I heard a snap as my arms and legs split, forming 8 black, spindly, thin legs. I collapsed onto them, unable to support myself. Mr. Brown's stick legs glided down in front of my face, his eyes inches from my own. As I told you, child, only the Dark Ones have the ability to consume an entire ocean of a soul. That is your fate. That is what you will become. Back in the room, my heart rate monitor crashed to a flat line. I felt the cold darkness swirl up my neck to my head as the void consumed me. I was aware of the nurses and doctors huddled around my body, prepping the crash cart, but all I felt was the cold consuming what was left of me. "Help me," I uttered. "Please." My physical body jolted from the electric paddles, but I felt nothing. Only the cold darkness. A needle injected into my IV line as they recharged for another burst of electricity. Still I felt nothing. Only cold, only darkness, only the vast emptiness of the void. Mr. Brown's stick legs tilted his head as he stared through his unblinking red eyes. He leaned forward, pressing his plate-like face to my forehead. I felt a vibration against my skin, followed by the tingling sensation of heat returning. The darkness receded back down my arms and legs. As he pulled back, the red in his eyes had diminished. A gift for the girl who gave me pants. A tear formed in my eye. It rolled down my cheek and fell onto the parched landscape below. Before I could say anything, an electronic jolt coursed through my body, pulling me away from the salt-flat expanse and back to my hospital room. The sinus rhythm of my heart rate monitor returned to normal. I felt the cool gel of the defibrillator paddles against my chest. I remember squeezing the hand of one of the attending nurses, who smiled down at me. "Look who's awake!" I cried, but it was different than before. I felt the pain I had long been avoiding, but I felt something else as well. I felt grateful, and I felt a sense of hope I hadn't known in a long time. It was a long road back from the darkness, but the thing about the road to recovery is that, like a road, it leads to a destination. After years of listless drifting towards the void, having a destination was an important first step in finding self-love. I reconnected with my mother, who was struggling with her own form of the darkness. We leaned on one another, talking and going to therapy as we worked through the issues that drove us apart. After my release from the hospital, I moved back home with her Facebook friend long gone. I got my GED and used my many sketchbooks as a portfolio to get an apprenticeship at a tattoo parlor. I've been clean for 4 years now, and it feels good to smile again. Granted, I still prefer Pierce the Veil to anything from Katy Perry's catalog, and my tattoos and jewelry have more skulls than fluffy bunnies, but that's all on the surface. I no longer crave the darkness to consume me. I often think about the vision with Mr. Brown's stick legs on the salt flats that night in the hospital. I had not seen him since that night, and I often wonder about the state of my soul since that day. Has it replenished, or is it still the dried-up barren wasteland that he took me to on the night? Last night, around 3 a.m, I finally got my answer. I woke up with a heaviness on my chest, arms and legs. At first I felt the grips of fear grabbing hold, much like the first time I experienced it. But then in the dark corner of my room, I saw glowing red eyes staring back at me from the shadows. In spite of my sleep paralysis, couldn't help but smile when I heard his voice call out to me. "Child, your soul tastes much better now." My missing husband came home, but I just know it isn't him. My husband went missing 6 months ago, just went out to work one day and never came home. It was a horrible shock to the whole neighborhood because things like that just didn't happen in our little slice of white picket fence suburbia. The police launched an investigation, and the neighborhood watch sent out search parties, but no one ever found any evidence to indicate what had happened to him. Our families were devastated. Recently, the missing posters have been taken down or papered over. The updates from the police became less frequent and dwindled away. I accepted that, hard as it was to admit. My Rick wasn't coming back. Until he did. A week ago, I was in the back garden watering my petunias when I heard the garden gate creak open. I jerked my head in that direction and there he was, exactly the same as he was the day he disappeared. Same windswept blonde hair and bright blue eyes, same curl to his pink lips. I was in shock. Our families had mourned for him. And yet there he was, standing in our garden like he had just popped out for milk or something. When I asked where he had been, he said he didn't know. He couldn't remember anything about the last 6 months. All our family and friends are beside themselves with joy. They almost can't believe it. But that's just the thing. I don't believe it. Look, I understand how crazy this all sounds, I do. Our families would never believe me, and I can't go to the police unless I want to end up in a straitjacket. But I just know that the man sleeping next to me isn't my husband. I don't know what to do. I know I should be happy, but I'm not. I'm terrified. I don't know much about anything supernatural or paranormal. I don't even like watching horror movies. But something about this whole situation makes my skin crawl. Just let me explain why I'm so sure. Once I've done that, hopefully one of you will believe me, and you'll be able to tell me what to do. The morning after Rick came home, I made him a cup of tea. When I handed it to him, he gave me the brightest smile. Then he took a sugar cube from the dish on the table and dropped it into the cup. Our house was in chaos with his return, and I was still in shock, so I didn't think much of it at the time, but it's been replaying in my mind ever since. I know it doesn't sound very significant, but my husband never put sugar in his tea. He was always adamant that it ruined the taste, and he'd get so frustrated if I ever put sugar in his cup by accident. And yet, this man had sugar. Then it was the golf. A few days ago, when he was out visiting his mom, I recorded a golf tournament that was showing on the TV. It was one of Rick's favorite golfers that was competing, and he never missed it. Once, he even skipped out on an anniversary dinner just to watch a championship. Only when he came home from his parents and I told him what I'd done, he just seemed unbothered. Like he said thanks and everything, and then he asked if I wanted to get dinner. He didn't even watch it, and that's just so out of character for him. Then one night I woke up around 2 a.m. to see Rick's face inches from mine, just looking at me with these blank eyes. I kind of gave this nervous laugh and asked, "Baby, what are you doing?" And he didn't answer for like a solid 30 seconds. He just stared, almost like he was looking right through me. Then he suddenly smiled and said, "Sorry, honey. Sometimes I just can't believe this is real." Then he just rolled over and went to sleep. I didn't get much sleep after that myself. Yesterday, about a week after he came home, the neighborhood threw a street party to celebrate his return. Everyone from our street and the streets on either side turned up to see him and tell him how happy they are that he's all right. When he wasn't standing with his arm around my waist, he was milling around, chatting amicably to each and every one of our neighbors, even the little kids. Jackson, our next-door neighbor Sally's toddler, wanted to play peekaboo, and Rick happily played along with a smile on his face. Now, my husband never did that. Rick always said he didn't like kids. That's why we never had any, and so he never wanted to play with any of the neighborhood children, especially not Jackson. Rick all but avoided him. Before he disappeared, I had started to suspect it was so I wouldn't see them together and notice the subtle but unmistakable similarities. The final nail in the coffin, proverbially speaking, was Sally. Just this morning, she came knocking on our door. Her excuse was the tray of brownies she carried, but I think she just wanted to push her way into our morning so that she could see for herself what the situation was. After she left, I called her a nosy busybody. Rick laughed, kissed my head, and agreed with me. That was when I knew for sure that it couldn't really be him. Rick always used to get so mad whenever I insulted Sally, like I didn't have any right to hate her even though she'd been fucking my husband for years. But today there was none of that. He didn't even try to defend her. I know what you must be thinking. If he was in an accident or something, he might have had some kind of traumatic brain injury that caused him to forget some things about his life, maybe even change his personality. And that's a valid, reasonable explanation. I have no doubt it's what the police would tell me if I reported all this. But you know why I'm dead certain that man isn't my husband? He doesn't have a scar. If he was really Rick, He'd have a scar on the side of his forehead shaped like the golf club I hit him with. But there's nothing, not a mark. Honestly, I'm this close to going out tonight and digging up my petunias just to make sure he's still under there. I don't know what I'm sharing a bed with, but I know it's not my husband. So what the hell am I going to do? Hi everyone. I want to thank you all for your concern and support. Even though I'm not giving out my real name, I obviously took a huge risk by telling anyone this at all, and I'm so grateful you've all tried to be helpful. I'm so sorry for the delay in updating. I've had some things to figure out, so I'll start with what I know. My husband is dead. In the end, I decided not to dig up the petunias. It was a rash, unadvisable notion which I have since abandoned because I realized how much worse things could get if I was caught. I've been smart about the whole thing so far, and I'm not about to throw that all away. It's too big of a risk. I did, however, thoroughly examine the flowers and the earth around them for any sign of disturbance, but I found none. Of course I found none. I don't know what I thought had happened, that my garden was some sort of pet cemetery, and my husband had clawed his way back from the beyond. Even to me, of all people, that sounds crazy. No, my husband is dead. In my heart, I know that beyond any shadow of a doubt, which means that whoever is in my kitchen right now is a complete stranger. He looks and sounds exactly like Rick. His own parents don't even notice the difference, for heaven's sake, but he doesn't act like him at all. Which tells me again that he is a stranger, that he never knew me before this, and he certainly never knew Rick. He doesn't enjoy the things Rick enjoyed. He doesn't say the sort of things Rick said. He doesn't complain, doesn't raise his voice, doesn't lie or gaslight or cheat. Frankly, he's a better husband than Rick ever was. Honestly, when I think about it like that, I'm almost tempted just to let it go. I tried to let it go, not to get caught up in worrying and just accept my new life for what it is. But I find myself unable to let it go. Because even though this man seems ordinary and kind and reasonable, there's one thing that scares me still. For someone to have so confidently taken Rick's place, they would somehow have to be sure themselves that the real Rick would not return to complicate their plans, however innocent or sinister those plans may be. Whoever this man is who is calling himself Rick, he must surely know that Rick is dead. And if he knows that, I would bet anything that he also knows how. I've gambled with my life and my freedom before, and I don't intend to do so again. A couple of you suggested that Rick might have had a twin that, for whatever reason, I never knew about, or perhaps a doppelganger who saw his chance at a more comfortable life and took it. Either of these seemed to me to be the closest to the realm of possibility, so they were the first theories I set out to confirm or disprove. A DNA test would surely be able to confirm whether this man is my husband's twin or someone completely unrelated. Of course, I was hardly going to tell him about it. At best, he would refuse, and at worst, well, I didn't want to find out. So about a week after my last post, I ordered 2 separate DNA tests designed for finding one's relatives and ancestors, and had them delivered whilst Rick was at work. Then a few nights later, I waited until he was asleep, actually asleep, not half asleep, and staring. And I pulled out a few strands of his hair, not enough that it would be noticeable in the morning, but sufficient amount to send away in a little tube to be analyzed. Much to my relief, he didn't wake up. I'm not sure how I would have explained it if he had. I sent the hair away to the DNA test companies, and they told me I'd have to wait a couple of weeks for the results. And in those couple of weeks, things have gotten stranger, shall we say. You see, I've noticed that Rick never seems to eat of his own accord. Like, he'll make dinner for us both, but that seems more to do with when I mention that I'm hungry than with his own desire to eat. He doesn't snack between meals. He never goes for a glass of water. I don't even think he takes anything with him to work for lunch. There's something else too. Rick's beard trimmer is still in its box, exactly where he left it 6 months ago, covered in dust and quite obviously unused. And yet, Rick has been home for nearly a month and his beard doesn't seem to be any longer, even though he used to trim it twice a week. On top of that, the staring has become a frequent occurrence, and not just in the middle of the night. I catch him watching me during the day too. always looking away or laughing it off whenever I notice him doing it. Anyway, I might as well tell you why I'm writing this now, because I can't make head nor tail of the situation anymore. The DNA tests came back in the mail this afternoon before Rick came home from work. I opened them quickly, eager to see who was included in the list of relatives, whether there were any names I recognized. Either way, it would answer my question. Only I don't have an answer. All I have are more questions, because the first test came back as inconclusive, with a note from the company telling me I had to send them a viable hair sample in order for it to work. I didn't understand that. I'd cut the hair myself, after all. And what did they mean by viable? But it was the second test that concerned me the most. Where there should have been information about demographic and regional origin, there was nothing, only a line of printed black letters spelling out the word unknown. Where there should have been a list of relatives and ancestors, there was no one. Not just no one related to Rick. No, I mean no one. According to the DNA test, this man has no relatives, no family, no ancestors, no biological connections, near or distant. That should be impossible, right? How can a person exist without any kind of relation? And how can he come from nowhere? I'm typing this up on the computer in the study, with several tabs open on various Google searches, as I try to figure out how this could be possible. The DNA test lies on the table behind me, taunting me with the evidence of everything I do not know. And then I hear it, clear as day, coming from the doorway behind me. Rebecca? If I didn't know better, I'd say my heart stopped. I would know that voice anywhere. I never heard him come in, never even heard the door open. Dimly, in the back of my mind, I recall that our door creaks every time it opens. How could I not have heard it? I turn over my shoulder towards not Rick, a false bright smile on my face. He is not smiling. His face is calm, but there's something hard about the line of his mouth that sets me on edge. What the hell is this? His voice is perfectly level, but something about it makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There's an undertone to his voice that I haven't noticed before now, something low and subtly grating. Even the real Rick never sounded like that. He holds something up, one eyebrow arched. When I see what he's holding, my stomach plummets. The results of the DNA test.